Hey guys, tonight we are journeying back in time, not just to witness a battle or the building of a pyramid, but to stand at the unsettling birth of an idea. The moment humans decided the bodies they were born with were merely a starting point. Imagine, we are in the cool, damp earth of northern Italy. The year is sometime around the 6th or 7th century AD. Below us, in a long-forgotten cemetery, lies a man. He's surrounded by the graves of his people, his kin, his community. But there is something profoundly different about him, something that makes the archaeologists who will find him 1,500 years later stop in stunned silence. From the elbow down, his right arm is not made of bone. It's made of iron. Fast forward through the centuries. This man, just one skeleton among many, is carefully excavated and given a sterile scientific designation, TUS 380. But that clinical label hides a story of unimaginable pain and unbelievable resilience. He lost his arm, and in an age of rampant infection and crude medicine, he chose not just to survive, but to upgrade. He has witnessed the fall of the Roman Empire and the dawn of a new, brutal age, and he has become a master of his own altered form, something more than just a man. So what does this ancient cyborg tell us about the human instinct to rebuild ourselves? How did he survive a procedure that should have killed him? And is this strange fusion of flesh and steel a one-off curiosity? Or does it reveal a deep, unsettling, and timeless drive to conquer our own physical limits? Thanks to incredible forensic analysis, tonight we will piece together his story and find the answers. Frankly, if you had a paper cut in his era, your odds of survival weren't exactly stellar, let alone attempting something like this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. That small click sends a big signal to the algorithm. That long-form, serious educational content still matters. And to me, it's an incredibly meaningful show of support. Thank you so much for helping keep this channel going strong. It always fascinates me to see where you're all tuning in from. Let me know in the comments where you are in the world and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are there, in that Lombard cemetery, watching as the final layers of soil are brushed away. The skeleton, which we'll call Tus, lies in repose, but your eyes are drawn to that right arm. A long, unrusted blade is fixed where his hand should be. It's not just lying next to him, it's attached. A bronze cap covers the ends of his bones, the radius and ulna, and from it extends the knife. Leather straps, long since decayed, once held it all together, but the ghost of their presence is still there. Let your mind drift back to the moment of the injury. Imagine Tus in the prime of his life. Perhaps it's the chaos of a shield wall, the crush of bodies, the shriek of metal on wood. An enemy axe falls. Not a clean cut, but a brutal, shattering blow. Or maybe it was a less heroic accident. A fall from a horse, a mishap with farm equipment. The result is the same. A mangled forearm, beyond any hope of saving. Now comes the truly terrifying part. You're in a world without anesthetic, without antibiotics, without even a basic understanding of germs. The village healer, or perhaps the blacksmith, comes with a bone saw. He is held down, biting on a leather strap as the saw rasps through muscle and bone. The wound is cauterized with a red-hot piece of iron, the smell of burning flesh filling the air. The agony is absolute. He should have died from the shock. He should have died from the blood loss. He certainly should have died from the infection that would have inevitably followed. But he didn't. And this is where the story shifts from one of mere survival to one of pure, insane audacity. The stumps of his forearm healed, and as they did, an idea took root. He wasn't going to be a cripple. He was going to be a weapon. The Lombards, you see, were a Germanic people who had swept into Italy after the Roman Empire crumbled. They were a warrior society, famed for their skill in metalworking, and a man's worth was often measured by his strength and prowess. For Tous, a missing hand wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a social death sentence. And so, he endured a second procedure. The blade, carefully forged, was fitted to him. This wasn't some clumsy hook. The design shows a D-shaped buckle on the end of the blade, which would have allowed him to strap it not just to his arm, but perhaps to a harness across his shoulder for stability. How do we know he used it? How do we know he lived with it for years? The proof is in his mouth. Forensic analysis of his skeleton reveals heavy wear on his right front teeth. The enamel is chipped and worn down in a way that perfectly matches the repetitive motion of pulling a leather strap tight with your teeth and your good hand. You can almost see him, every morning, performing this ritual. A quiet, intimate moment of maintenance with his own body. The scientific evidence is undeniable. His teeth are the user's manual for his prosthetic arm. Furthermore, the ends of his arm bones show significant remodeling and bone calluses, a clear sign of long-term healing and adaptation to the pressure of the device. But historians still argue whether this modification was a personal choice, born of battlefield necessity, or a culturally significant status symbol among Lombard warriors. Was he a celebrated veteran, his knife hand a mark of honor? Or was he a solitary, stubborn man who simply refused to be made helpless? This incredible drive to replace what is lost is not unique to Tous. While he may be the most extreme example, we've found other, more subtle instances from the ancient world. Consider the Greville-Chester great toe, a quirky tidbit from ancient Egypt. It's a 3,000-year-old prosthetic big toe, carved from wood and leather, found on the mummy of a noblewoman. It shows signs of wear, meaning she actually walked on it. It wasn't just for show in the afterlife. It was a functional piece of medical engineering from the time of the pharaohs. Tous' story, however, feels different. It feels more visceral. He didn't just replace a toe for balance. He replaced a hand with a blade. He fused the organic with the inorganic and transformed himself into something new. He stands as a testament to the human spirit's bizarre and sometimes terrifying refusal to accept its limits. He is the ancient ancestor of every person with a pacemaker, a titanium joint, or a bionic limb. He is proof that the dream of becoming a cyborg is not a product of science fiction, but a deep, primal instinct that has been lurking in our collective consciousness for a very, very long time. That incredible drive to modify the body, to reforge flesh and bone into something new, didn't stop at the limbs. From the story of Tous and his iron hand, we journey deeper, both into the past and into the human form itself. We are moving from the arm to the head. Because if replacing a hand with a blade seems insane, imagine the conviction it would take to look at a friend suffering from terrible headaches, or perhaps frightening visions, and conclude that the obvious solution is to carve a hole in their skull. You are no longer in medieval Italy. The air is different now, thick with the smoke of a wood fire and the smell of damp earth and animal hides. You are in a small Neolithic settlement somewhere in France, about 7,000 years ago. A man is lying on the floor of a hut, his head resting in the lap of a family member. He is conscious. His eyes are wide with a mixture of fear and a strange, desperate hope. Another figure, the one we might call a shaman or an early surgeon, kneels beside him. In his hand he holds not a saw or a knife, but a piece of flint, expertly knapped to a razor-sharp edge. There is no sterilization. There is no anesthetic. There is only the low, rhythmic chanting of the healer and the strained breathing of the patient. And then it begins. The healer makes a careful incision in the scalp, peeling the skin back to expose the pale white surface of the bone. Then, using the sharp flint, he begins to scrape. Imagine the sound. A soft, grating noise, like sanding wood that travels directly through the patient's skull into his own ears. For hours this continues, a slow, methodical process of abrasion, the healer meticulously wearing away the bone, layer by layer. There's no rush. A slip of the tool could puncture the dura mater, the delicate membrane protecting the brain, leading to almost certain death. But this practitioner is skilled. He has done this before. He knows the exact moment when the bone becomes thin enough, when the pressure changes, when he is about to break through. Finally, a small section of bone is lifted away, revealing the pulsating surface of the brain's protective sheath beneath. The whole is complete. This procedure, trepanation, is one of the oldest and most unnervingly successful forms of surgery in human history. And the most insane part, it wasn't a rare or isolated practice. This is our mainstream historical fact. Trepanation was a global phenomenon. Skulls with these deliberate man-made holes have been found all over the world, from Europe and Africa to China and the Americas, practiced by countless cultures that had absolutely no contact with one another. It seems that for thousands of years, whenever human beings were confronted with a problem inside the head, they independently came to the same terrifying conclusion. We have to get in there. The proof of their success is etched in the bone itself. The scientific evidence here is astonishingly clear. When you look at these ancient skulls, you can see that the edges of the hole are often smooth, rounded, and healed over. This isn't sharp, broken bone from an injury. This is the slow, unmistakable sign of bone regrowth. This healing process, called callus formation, proves that the patient didn't die on the operating mat. They lived for months, for years, sometimes even decades after the surgery. In some archaeological sites, the survival rate is estimated to be as high as 90%. Some skulls even show multiple holes, made at different times, meaning a person went through this horrifying ordeal, survived, and then, for some reason, volunteered to do it all over again. But that just deepens the mystery. Why? Why would anyone do this? On this question, archaeologists and medical historians still argue fiercely over the purpose of trepanation. One school of thought believes it was primarily medical. In a violent, prehistoric world, a nasty blow to the head from a club or a sling stone could cause a subdural hematoma, bleeding and swelling inside the skull. The pressure builds, leading to excruciating pain and death. A trepanation hole would be a desperate but potentially effective way to relieve that pressure. It might also have been used to treat visible skull fractures by removing shattered bone fragments. The other school of thought argues for a magical or ritualistic purpose. Perhaps those headaches, seizures, or bouts of madness weren't seen as medical conditions, but as the work of a malevolent spirit trapped inside the head. The hole was not for letting pressure out, but for letting the demon escape. It could have been a rite of passage, a way to attain a higher state of consciousness, or a mark of a shaman. The most fascinating and quirky tidbit supporting this ritual theory is the discovery that the little discs of bone removed from the skull, called rondelle, were sometimes drilled with a second, smaller hole and worn as an amulet. You would wear a piece of your own skull around your neck, perhaps to ward off the very evil you'd had released, or as a symbol of your unique spiritual journey. It's a strange thought that this brutal, primitive act is the direct ancestor of modern neurosurgery. The impulse is the same, to fix the brain. But it was born from a worldview so alien to ours, a world where the physical and the spiritual were inextricably linked. And the idea never completely vanished. There is a small, fringe movement of people even today who advocate for modern trepanation, believing that drilling a hole in the skull increases blood flow to the brain and unlocks a permanent state of enlightenment. It seems the desire to open our minds, sometimes literally, is a persistent human obsession. But if making a hole in the skull seems like an extreme form of therapy, it pales in comparison to the idea of taking a perfectly healthy newborn infant and completely changing the shape of their head from the moment they are born. From the calculated risk of drilling a hole in the skull, we now turn to a practice that speaks to an even deeper, more profound human desire to sculpt the body from birth, to physically mark oneself for life, or perhaps for status. If you thought trepanation was an extreme form of self-expression or therapy, prepare yourself for the long, slow, and utterly deliberate process of reshaping the very vessel of the soul. Artificial cranial deformation. Imagine you are a parent living in a small village in the central Andes, perhaps around 2,000 years ago. Your newborn child, a tiny, fragile bundle, has just entered the world with a soft, pliable skull, full of the promise of a unique life. But in your culture, a normal, rounded head is not the ideal. It signifies commonness, perhaps even a lack of sophistication. For your child to thrive, to be recognized as noble or beautiful, or even to belong to a specific tribal group, their head must be reshaped. The process begins almost immediately. You carefully place padded boards, or perhaps tightly woven cloths, around your infant's delicate head. Day after day, week after week, month after month, you adjust these bindings. The pressure is gentle but constant, slowly, subtly, imperceptibly forcing the growing skull to conform to a new shape. Sometimes it's elongated and conical, stretching upwards like a sugar loaf. Other times it's flattened at the back and front, creating an exaggerated, wide and low profile. It's not about pain, it's about slow, steady, continuous pressure on still-forming bone. The child cries, as all infants do, but eventually they grow accustomed to the bindings, much like they grow accustomed to being swaddled. By the time they are a few years old, the process is complete. Their skull is permanently molded, their identity literally etched into their bone structure. This isn't an isolated, quirky practice. This is our mainstream historical fact. Artificial cranial deformation was astonishingly global. It was practiced by the Huns, those fearsome horsemen who swept across Europe, leaving behind skulls with dramatically elongated craniums. It was common among the Maya in Mesoamerica, where flattened foreheads were a mark of nobility. The Mangbetu people of Central Africa practiced it well into the 20th century, creating towering conical heads as a sign of aristocratic beauty. Cultures with no geographical or temporal connection independently arrived at the same bizarre method for defining identity. So, what was the underlying logic? What drove societies to inflict such a strange, permanent alteration on their youngest and most vulnerable? The why is complex, often intertwined with status, beauty, and ethnic identity. In many societies, a reshaped head was a visible, undeniable marker of who you were, your lineage, and your place in the social hierarchy. Imagine a society where your normal head would make you look like a foreigner, or worse, like someone of a lower class. It was a physical passport, an unalterable emblem of belonging. It was considered beautiful, perhaps even making people appear more like their gods. The crucial detail, the scientific evidence that dispels some of the more sensational theories, is that while the shape of the skull was dramatically altered, the cranial volume remained the same. This means there was no significant impact on brain function, intelligence, or overall cognitive ability. These individuals were just as smart, capable, and complex as those with naturally shaped heads. The brain, being a remarkably adaptable organ, simply grew to fill the newly shaped cavity. This wasn't about creating super geniuses or reducing intellect. It was purely about aesthetics and social coding. One of the most visually striking examples comes from the Paracas culture of Peru. This is our quirky tidbit. Their elongated skulls, some almost twice the length of a normal human skull, are so extreme that they frequently fuel fringe theories about alien intervention. Online, you'll find endless discussions and documentaries claiming these are irrefutable proof of non-human beings, pointing to their bizarre, otherworldly appearance. Yet DNA evidence and archaeological context have repeatedly confirmed that these are unequivocally human remains, simply molded by human hands. It's a testament to how profoundly unsettling this practice can be to a modern eye. But as with so many ancient mysteries, the precise details of its origin and spread remain debated. Anthropologists still debate whether the practice spread from a single origin point, diffusing across continents through migration and cultural exchange, or if it was independently invented multiple times as a response to a universal human desire to culturally mark the body. Did one group start it, and others copied the idea? Or did the same impulse arise in different place, without any connection, driven by similar social or spiritual needs? Whether for status, beauty, or belonging, the reshaping of the infant skull tells us something profound about humanity's relationship with its own form. It's an extreme example of the lengths we will go to fit in, to stand out, to embody an ideal. It shows a complete disregard for the natural body in favor of a culturally constructed one. It's an ancient mirror reflecting our modern obsession with cosmetic surgery, with tattoos, with piercings. The desire to make our exterior match our internal sense of self, or what society expects of us. It is a reminder that what we perceive as normal or beautiful is often a cultural construct, one that can push us to perform the most bizarre and enduring modifications on ourselves, starting from the moment we are born. And if changing the shape of the head wasn't enough, some cultures decided to completely transform the entire body, from the tip of the head down to the toes, sometimes with agonizing, life-altering consequences. Our journey across the landscape of the human body has shown us a willingness to modify our limbs and reshape our skulls. Now, we broaden our focus, moving from the head down to the feet, to explore a practice that, for 1,000 years, defined beauty, status, and femininity for hundreds of millions of women, all through an excruciating process of controlled bodily destruction. We are, of course, talking about foot binding. You are no longer in a Neolithic village or a Peruvian settlement. You are in Imperial China, perhaps during the Qing dynasty. You are a young girl, no more than 5 or 6 years old. Your feet are being soaked in a warm mixture of herbs and animal blood to soften them. Your toenails are clipped as short as possible. Your mother, or grandmother, sits before you. This is not an act of cruelty in her eyes. It is an act of love, of securing you a better future, a good marriage. She takes your foot in her hands and, with a steady, practiced pressure, she breaks the 4 smaller toes and curls them under the sole. Then she takes a long silk ribbon and begins to bind your foot, pulling your heel and toes together, forcing the arch of your foot to break and bulge upwards. The pain is blinding, a white-hot agony that will become your constant companion for years. The bindings are changed every few days, pulled tighter each time, forcing your foot into the idealized golden lotus shape, a tiny pointed appendage no more than 3 or 4 inches long. You cannot walk properly. You are forced to hobble on your heels, your gait a delicate swaying motion that poets would praise as the lotus gait. Infection is a constant risk. Toes can rot and fall off. But if you survive, if your feet are successfully bound, you are considered beautiful. You are considered marriageable. This is the central insane paradox of foot binding, our mainstream historical fact. This practice, which began in the 10th century and lasted until the early 20th, was a powerful symbol of beauty and high social status. A woman with bound feet was a woman who did not need to work. Her immobility was a living advertisement for her husband's or father's wealth. He was so prosperous that his women were purely ornamental. For 1,000 years, this ideal of a crippled, dependent beauty held sway, a cultural norm so powerful it overrode the most basic instincts of physical well-being. The results of this practice are laid bare by science. The scientific evidence from X-rays of bound feet is deeply unsettling. They show a skeletal structure that is almost unrecognizable as a human foot, with the metatarsal bones and phalanges bent and twisted into a grotesque, permanent clench. Skeletons of elderly women from this period show a high incidence of hip and spine fractures, the result of a lifetime of instability and frequent falls. And yet China was not alone in its pursuit of culturally defined beauty through extreme modification. Around the world, the human body has been used as a living canvas. Think of the Kayan women of Myanmar, known for the brass coils they wear around their necks. Starting in childhood, rings are added one by one, creating the illusion of a greatly elongated neck. In reality, the rings don't lengthen the neck itself. They depress the collarbone and ribcage, creating a stunning but physically taxing aesthetic. Or consider the practice of scarification. Common in many cultures across Africa and indigenous Australia. Here, the skin is deliberately cut, and irritants like ash are rubbed into the wound to create raised keloid scars. These are not random marks. They are intricate patterns that signify tribal identity, social status, or key life events. This brings us to a fascinating, quirky tidbit. In some of these cultures, these scar patterns were so essential to a person's identity that they were considered more reliable for recognition than facial features. The scars told the story of who you were in a language more profound than a mere face could convey. From the lip plates of the Mursi women in Ethiopia, which stretched the lower lip to incredible dimensions, to the earlobe stretching of the Maasai, the impulse is the same: to transform the body according to a specific cultural blueprint. This forces us to confront a difficult question, one that remains a point of contention. Scholars argue whether these practices should be viewed through a modern lens of mutilation or as profound expressions of cultural identity and spiritual belief, no different in principle from modern tattoos or cosmetic surgery. Are we right to be horrified by foot binding, or are we simply applying our own cultural biases to a practice that held deep meaning for those who participated in it? There's no easy answer. But what's clear is that the human body has never been just a biological fact. It is a story we tell ourselves and each other about who we are. And sometimes, in the telling of that story, we are willing to break our own bones, stretch our skin, and endure unimaginable pain, all in the name of an idea. The body is not a temple to be preserved, but a piece of clay to be molded. And as we've seen, that molding can be a beautiful, terrifying, and profoundly insane process. But this is all about changing the body of the living. What happens when we turn this obsessive, transformative impulse on the dead? We have seen how human culture can twist and reshape the living body, molding it to fit an ideal of beauty or status. But now, our journey takes a darker turn. We are leaving behind the realm of ritual and aesthetics and venturing into a much older, more primal territory, the brutal realities of survival and violence. We are going to explore the moment when one of our own ancestors looked at another, not as family, not as a rival, but as food. Close your eyes and let the familiar world dissolve. You are no longer in a recognizable human society. You are standing on the grasslands of what will one day be Kenya. 1.45 million years ago. The air is hot and dry. The world is oversized, populated by giant elephants, saber-toothed cats, and our own ancestors, primitive hominins who are struggling to find their place in the food chain. They are both hunter and hunted, living in a state of constant, gnawing uncertainty. Here, in this ancient, hostile world, a quiet, terrible event takes place. It leaves no witnesses, only a single, silent piece of evidence that will wait for over 1 million years to tell its story. Fast forward to the 21st century. You are in the clean, quiet storeroom of a museum. An anthropologist, Dr. Brianna Pobiner, is meticulously examining fossil collections that were excavated years ago. She's not looking for anything in particular, just doing the patient, often tedious work of reanalysis. She picks up a fragment of a hominin tibia, a shin bone. It's unremarkable at first glance, but as she turns it under the light, she sees them, a series of faint parallel scratches. Her heart likely begins to beat a little faster. These don't look like the random gnaw marks of a crocodile or a hyena. They look deliberate. This is where the story becomes a forensic investigation. The bone is taken to a lab. This brings us to our scientific evidence. Using high-powered 3D scanners and powerful microscopes, scientists analyze every millimeter of the marks. They can see the telltale signs of stone tools. Animal teeth leave U-shaped grooves, often with smaller counterbite marks on the other side of the bone. But these are clean, V-shaped incisions, with microscopic striations inside the grooves that show the direction of the cut, the angle of the blade. There are 9 of these cut marks, clustered right where the calf muscle would have attached to the bone. The perfect place to slice through a tendon and remove a large piece of meat. And there are 2 more marks, a little further down. Percussion marks, where the bone was hammered with a stone, likely to crack it open and get at the rich, nutritious marrow inside. The conclusion is inescapable. This hominin, likely a relative of Homo erectus, did not die of natural causes and was not scavenged by animals. It was systematically butchered by another hominin with a stone tool. This discovery is our mainstream historical fact. At this point in deep prehistory, our ancestors were using what we call Oldowan and early Acheulean tools. These weren't elegant, symmetrical hand axes yet. They were often simple, sharp-edged flakes knocked off a larger core stone. They look crude to us, but in the hands of an early human, they were more than sharp enough to slice through hide and flesh. For a long time, we assumed these tools were used exclusively for hunting animals or processing tough plants. This bone proves otherwise. And here's the quirky tidbit that makes this discovery even more compelling. This world-changing fossil wasn't a new find from a dramatic expedition. It was a museum discovery. The bone had been sitting in a collection in Nairobi, misidentified as some kind of animal fossil, for years. It was a secret hiding in plain sight, a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest discoveries aren't made in the field, but in the patient re-examination of things we thought we already understood. This single 1.45 million-year-old shin bone represents the oldest definitive evidence of a human relative being butchered. And naturally, the discovery ignited a debate. Was this the first evidence of cannibalism for survival, a ritualistic act, or simply one hominin species treating another as mere prey? We can never know for sure. There are no other clues. Was it a desperate act during a famine, where the taboo of eating one's own kind was broken for survival? Was it some kind of ritual, a way of consuming an enemy's strength or honoring the dead? Or was it something even more chilling, a complete lack of recognition? One group of hominins simply viewing another as a potential meal, no different from an antelope? Whatever the reason, this one bone drags a dark aspect of human behavior far deeper into our past than we ever thought possible. The capacity to view our own kind as a resource, as meat, is not a recent corruption of our nature. It's a behavior that is nearly as old as our genus itself. It's a ghost that has been haunting our family tree for 1.5 million years. And while this is just one bone, a quiet whisper from the dawn of time in later eras, that whisper would become a deafening, horrifying scream. The single million-year-old shin bone was a whisper from the distant past, a hint of a dark potential within our lineage. But now, we leap forward in time, to a place where that whisper has become a fully realized, blood-curdling scream. We are leaving the speculative world of a single fossil and entering a complete and horrifying scene, frozen in time. A place that can only be described as a cannibal's kitchen. You are in the arid, sun-baked landscape of southwestern Colorado around the year 1150 AD. This is the world of the ancestral Puebloans, a sophisticated culture known for their stunning cliff dwellings and intricate pottery. But the scene you are witnessing is far from that peaceful image. You are at an archaeological site known as Cowboy Wash, and you're standing before a series of humble pit houses, early dwellings dug partially into the earth. They were abandoned suddenly, and archaeologists in the 1990s would uncover the reason why. As you step inside one of the structures, the story begins to tell itself, and it is a grim one. Strewn across the floor are the remains of at least 7 people, men, women, and children. But this is not a burial. This is a processing site. The bodies have been systematically dismembered, the bones defleshed with the same precision used on a hunted deer. Long bones, like the femur and humerus, have been smashed open, the marrow scraped out. Skulls were not just broken, they were heated over a fire until the bone cracked, allowing access to the brain. And inside, archaeologists found scrape marks from tools used to scoop it out. Vertebrae and other small bones show signs of being boiled in pots, a technique used to extract every last calorie of grease and nutrients from a carcass. This was not a frenzied, desperate act. It was a methodical, practiced butchery. What could possibly lead to such a nightmarish event? The answer is written in the landscape itself. This is our mainstream historical fact. The late 12th and early 13th centuries were a time of profound crisis for the people of this region. Tree ring data reveals a period of intense, prolonged drought, one of the worst in 1,000 years. The corn, beans, and squash that formed the basis of their diet failed year after year. The delicate social fabric that held their communities together began to tear, and violence, born of starvation and desperation, became commonplace. For decades, the idea of cannibalism among the ancestral Puebloans was a controversial, often dismissed theory. The evidence, while suggestive, was always circumstantial. That all changed at Cowboy Wash. Here, archaeologists found the smoking gun, the irrefutable, stomach-turning proof. It is our scientific evidence. In the ashes of a hearth, they found a coprolite, a piece of fossilized human feces. When this coprolite was analyzed in a lab, it tested positive for human myoglobin, a protein found only in human muscle tissue. There is no ambiguous interpretation here. Someone sat at this fire, cooked and consumed the flesh of another human being, and then defecated into the embers. It is the most direct evidence of cannibalism ever found in the archaeological record. This grim reality is even hinted at in the name we used to use for these people. The term Anasazi, which many of us learned in school, is actually a Navajo word. This is our quirky tidbit. The word means ancient enemies. It's a name given by a later culture, one that hints at a folk memory of intense conflict and violence. For this reason, modern descendants and archaeologists prefer the more neutral term, ancestral Puebloans. But that old name carries a faint echo of the terror that sites like Cowboy Wash represent. The discovery of the coprolite ended the debate on if cannibalism happened, but it started a new one. Archaeologists are divided on whether this was starvation cannibalism, a desperate act of survival, or a form of terror cannibalism, used as a weapon of war to wipe out and demoralize rival groups during a period of intense competition for scarce resources. Was the family at Cowboy Wash eaten by neighbors simply trying to survive another week without food? Or were they attacked by a rival clan, their bodies desecrated in the most profound way imaginable as a form of psychological warfare, a message to others to stay away from their territory and resources? The extreme processing, the almost ritualistic way the bodies were consumed and their remains scattered, suggests to some that this was more than just a meal. It was a statement. Cowboy Wash provides a chillingly complete snapshot of a society in collapse. It moves beyond the abstract horror of a single ancient bone and forces us to confront a detailed tableau of human brutality. It is a stark reminder that the line between a thriving civilization and a nightmare of violence can be as thin as a few years of failed rains. And it raises a disturbing question. What happens when this kind of violence isn't just an aberration, but becomes part of a ritual, a core component of how we understand death and the afterlife? We have witnessed the grim reality of a society pushed to the brink, where the line between neighbor and meal dissolved under the harsh sun of a changing climate. But the human relationship with the dead is not always one of brutal consumption. Now, we pull back from the horror of the cannibal's kitchen and journey deeper into a place of quiet, profound mystery. we're going to explore a discovery that challenges the very definition of who we are, suggesting that the contemplation of death and the birth of ritual may not have begun with us. Your journey starts at the mouth of the Rising Star cave system in South Africa. The air is warm on the surface, but as you descend, it grows cool and damp, the smell of wet limestone filling your senses. This is not a pleasant, tourist-friendly cave with walkways and electric lights. This is a descent into the deep, prehistoric earth. The passages narrow. Soon you are on your hands and knees, crawling through the dark. Then comes the feature known as Superman's Crawl, a passage so tight, just 7.5 inches high, that you must extend one arm forward and suck in your breath just to inch your way through. After that, a vertical climb up a jagged rock face called the Dragon's Back, followed by a final terrifyingly narrow chute that drops you 40 feet into a pitch-black chamber below. There is no easy way to get here. You cannot fall in by accident. A predator cannot drag its prey this deep. A flood cannot wash bodies into this secluded chamber. Every inch of this journey requires effort, intention, and a light source. And it is here, in the Dinaledi chamber, deep within the earth, that a team of explorers in 2013 found something that would rewrite human prehistory. The beams of their lights swept across the floor, revealing bones. Not just a few scattered fragments, but a dense carpet of them. Over 1,500 fossil specimens, belonging to a creature unlike any seen before. This was Homo naledi, a new species in our own genus. They were small, slender, with an ape-like upper body but surprisingly modern-looking hands and feet. Most shockingly, their brain was tiny, no bigger than an orange. And yet, here they were, at least 15 individuals, infants, children, young adults, and the elderly. A cross-section of a community, all resting together in this impossible-to-reach chamber. Initially, no one knew how old they were. Their strange mix of primitive and modern features made them difficult to place. But our mainstream historical fact comes from the later, astonishing dating of the remains. Homo naledi lived between 335,000 and 236,000 years ago. This was a bombshell. It meant this small-brained, archaic-looking relative was alive at the exact same time that early Homo sapiens were emerging in Africa. They were our contemporaries, our neighbors on the evolutionary landscape. The evidence within the cave points to only one radical conclusion. This is our scientific evidence. The remains are largely complete skeletons, not scattered bones. They show no signs of predator marks or damage from a fall or a flood. The sediment they were found in shows that they were deposited over a long period of time, not all at once. Recent discoveries in the cave system have even revealed evidence of hearths for fire and potential abstract engravings on the cave walls, simple cross-hatchings and geometric shapes. The overwhelming implication is that the Homo naledi brought their own dead here, one by one, over generations, using fire to light the way. This is not just disposing of bodies. It looks like a cemetery. It looks like a tomb. And this brings us to the core of the issue, because this finding is at the heart of one of paleontology's biggest debates. Does this represent the intentional disposal of the dead by a non-sapiens species? If so, it pushes the origin of complex ritual behavior back hundreds of thousands of years. For decades, we have defined our own species, Homo sapiens, by our capacity for symbolic thought, for art, for religion, for ritual. We believed we were the first creatures to look at death and see something more than just an ending, the the first to create ceremony around it. Homo naledi, with its tiny brain, challenges that cherished idea. Could this creature have possessed a mind capable of grief, of a belief in an afterlife, of a sacred space for the dead? This brings us to a wonderful quirky tidbit about the discovery itself. Because the passages into the Dynaledi chamber were so incredibly narrow, the lead paleoanthropologist Lee Berger couldn't get in himself. He had to put out a call on social media for experienced cavers, who were also scientists and, crucially, were skinny enough to fit. The team he assembled, the ones who performed the actual excavation, were a group of 6 women who became known as the underground astronauts. It's a perfect example of a modern science requiring a very specific and rather old-fashioned physical attribute to unlock the secrets of our past. The discovery of Homo naledi is a profound lesson in humility. It suggests that the dawn of ritual, the first stirrings of a spiritual or symbolic consciousness, might not be our story alone. It may be a much older, deeper story that belongs to the entire human family. It's the idea that long before us, another kind of human was navigating treacherous darkness, carrying their lost loved ones to a final, quiet resting place deep within the earth. And if these ancient relatives were already treating their dead with such care, it makes the things our own species would later do to their ancestors all the more bizarre and unsettling. The quiet reverence of the Homo naledi in their deep, dark cave hints at the dawn of a spiritual connection with the dead. But as our own species, Homo sapiens, began to build the first settled communities, that connection took on a new and startlingly intimate form. We are moving now from the mystery of the first tomb to one of the most personal and unsettling rituals ever conceived, a way of not just remembering the dead, but inviting them to stay. Your surroundings shift. You are now in one of the oldest towns in the world, the ancient settlement of Jericho, about 10,000 years ago. You're sitting inside a small, circular house made of sun-dried mud bricks. The air is warm and smells of wood smoke, grain, and other people. Life is becoming sedentary for the first time. People are learning to farm, to live together in large groups, to own property. And with this new sense of place and permanence comes a new relationship with their ancestors. You look down at the hard-packed earth floor. Beneath your very feet, buried just a few inches down, are the remains of the family who lived here before you. For them, the home was also the tomb. But the story doesn't end there. Imagine a family gathering, sometime after a beloved elder has passed away and been buried beneath the floor. There is a quiet ceremony. The floor is dug up, and the skeleton is carefully exhumed. With great tenderness, the skull is removed from the rest of the body, which is then reburied. This is where the truly bizarre and creative process begins. You watch as they take the skull and carefully detach the lower jawbone, the mandible, and set it aside. Then they begin to prepare a wet plaster, a mixture of lime and clay. They lovingly, skillfully, apply this plaster to the dry bone, filling in the hollows of the eye sockets, rebuilding the bridge of the nose, recreating the curve of the cheeks. This is not a crude covering. It's a detailed, sensitive act of portraiture. They are sculpting the face of the person they knew, bringing their features back to life in plaster. When the sculpture is complete, they take 2 halves of a cowrie shell, their lustrous surfaces still shining, and press them into the eye sockets, giving the face a serene, wide-eyed gaze. Sometimes the plaster is painted with ochre to give it a lifelike, ruddy hue. The ancestor is reborn. This incredible practice is our mainstream historical fact. These plastered skulls were not unique to Jericho. They are a hallmark of what archaeologists call the pre-pottery Neolithic B period, and they have been found at sites all across the Levant, from modern-day Syria and Jordan to Israel and Palestine. For a period of a few thousand years, this was a major cultural and religious tradition for the world's first farmers, and these were not morbid trophies to be hidden away. They were kept in the house, displayed, handled, perhaps passed around during rituals. They were, in a very real sense, still part of the family. Wise elders whose physical presence continued to inhabit the home long after their breath was gone. And modern science has allowed us to meet them. Our scientific evidence comes from non-invasive technologies like CT scans. By scanning the skulls, we can see the real bone beneath the plaster, confirming they are not just sculptures, but actual human remains. These scans can tell us the age of the person at death, their sex, and even details about their dental health. We can look past the plaster mask and see the real person who lived and died 10,000 years ago. Of course, the ultimate question is why they did this. While early theories suggested they might be trophies of vanquished enemies, the consensus now leans toward a form of ancestor worship. But scholars still argue about their exact function. Were they conduits to the spirit world, allowing the living to communicate with the dead? Were they a kind of legal document, a physical representation of a family's lineage and their claim to a particular piece of land in these new, settled communities? Having your great-great-grandfather's head on the shelf might have been the ultimate proof that this house, this farm, belonged to you. The level of care and personalization is what makes this practice so fascinating. And here's a wonderful quirky tidbit. Some of the skulls show signs of having been repaired or even replastered over time. You can imagine a plaster nose getting chipped after a few generations of being handled, and a descendant carefully mixing up a new batch to fix it. It suggests a long, continued relationship with the object, and with the ancestor it represented. They were maintaining the faces of their dead, keeping their memory literally intact. The plastered skulls of Jericho represent a profound shift in human consciousness. It's the desire not just to bury the dead, but to cheat death itself, to keep the faces of loved ones physically present in the world of the living. It is a beautiful, haunting, and deeply insane expression of love and memory. It's a refusal to let go. But as we will see, this impulse to hold on to the dead, to use their remains to tell a story, would be taken to an even more extreme and constructive conclusion in a cold, misty corner of the ancient world. Keeping a plastered skull of your great-grandfather in the living room is one thing. It's an intimate, if unsettling, way of refusing to let go of the past. But our journey now takes us to a place where the human impulse to manipulate the dead wasn't just about preservation, it was about construction. We're leaving the sun-baked Levant for the misty, wind-swept shores of the Outer Hebrides in Scotland, to a time when ancestors weren't just remembered, they were literally built. Picture a Bronze Age settlement around 3,000 years ago on the island of South Uist. The people here live in stone roundhouses huddled against the Atlantic winds. Life is hard, and the connection to land, to lineage, to the ancestors is everything. Like the people of Jericho, they bury their dead beneath the floors of their homes, keeping them physically close. In the 1980s, archaeologists excavating a site called Clad Hullen discovered the remains of several individuals, including what appeared to be an adult male and an adult female, buried in the foundations. For years, it was considered an interesting, but not particularly earth-shattering, find. The story should have ended there. But with the dawn of advanced biochemical analysis, the archaeologists decided to take another look. And what they found was so mind-bogglingly strange, it sounds like something out of a gothic horror novel. The scientific evidence came first from radiocarbon dating and isotopic analysis, which can tell you when a person died and what their diet was like. The results made no sense. The head of the female skeleton was several decades older than her torso. Her jawbone was a century older than her skull. This wasn't one person. Then came the DNA analysis. The truth was revealed to be even more bizarre than the dating suggested. The skeleton, believed to be a single woman, was, in fact, a composite of at least 3 different people. It had the skull and torso of one woman, the head of a man who had died around the same time, and the limbs of a third person, another male, who had died a few centuries earlier. The male skeleton lying nearby was also a jigsaw puzzle, assembled from the parts of 3 different men who had also died hundreds of years apart. This wasn't a burial, it was an art project. How is this even possible? How do you keep human remains in a condition to be assembled like a morbid Lego set hundreds of years after death? The answer lies in the unique environment of the Scottish Isles. This is our mainstream historical fact. The region is famous for its peat bogs. A peat bog is a highly acidic, waterlogged, and low-oxygen environment, which makes it incredibly effective at preventing decay. Famous bog bodies, like the Tolland man from Denmark, have been found with their skin, hair, and internal organs perfectly preserved after thousands of years. The bones of the Clad Halland skeletons showed telltale signs of demineralization, a chemical signature consistent with having been pickled in a peat bog for a significant period, perhaps 6 months to a year, before being retrieved. This was a deliberate, multi-stage, and incredibly labor-intensive process. You die. Your body is placed in a bog to mummify. Generations later, your descendants retrieve your preserved corpse, along with the mummified bodies of other long-dead individuals from different families or eras. Then, in an act of profound and baffling creativity, they disarticulate the bodies and reassemble them into a new, composite ancestor. This leads to a fascinating and quirky tidbit about the logistics of the whole affair. In order to make the composite skeleton hold together before it was formally buried in the house's foundation, it had to be articulated in a fetal or seated position. This suggests it wasn't just assembled and immediately buried. It was likely cured or held together in this pose for a specific ritual, perhaps put on display before its final interment. They were building a symbolic figure. But why? The question is so fundamental, so far outside our modern frame of reference, that it's almost impossible to answer. The purpose is a complete mystery, forcing archaeologists to reconsider everything they thought they knew about Bronze Age burial rites. Was this an attempt to create a super ancestor, combining the lineages or spirits of multiple important people into one symbolic figure? Perhaps it was a political act, a way of uniting 2 rival clans by literally merging their founding ancestors into a single, shared being. Maybe by combining a wise elder with a strong warrior and a fertile woman, you were creating a powerful magical totem to protect the new home. The worldview that would lead to such a practice is profoundly alien to us. It suggests that for these people, individual identity was not locked within a single body. The physical form was fluid, something that could be taken apart and put back together to serve a greater communal purpose. It elevates the manipulation of the dead from the preservation of one person to the creation of a new one. It is, without a doubt, one of the most insane and thought-provoking discoveries in the history of archaeology, a silent testament to a time when the boundaries between life and death, between individual and community, were not just blurred, but completely redrawn. And if you think that's the strangest thing our species has done with its dead, just wait until we travel high into the Himalayas, to a mysterious lake full of bones. The jigsaw ancestors of Scotland present a mystery of human intention, a deliberate, almost artistic manipulation of the dead. But some places on Earth are mysteries not because of what people have done, but because of what has been done to them. We now travel from the wind-swept Scottish Isles to the breathtaking, lethal altitude of the high Himalayas, to a place where a single, recurring tragedy has accumulated, leaving behind a chilling and inexplicable congregation of the dead. Your journey is a difficult one. You are ascending into the mountains of Uttarakhand, India, climbing higher and higher until the air grows thin and cold, and the landscape becomes a stark panorama of rock and ice. Your destination is Rupkund, a small glacial lake nestled in a mountain hollow over 16,000 feet above sea level. For most of the year, it is a frozen, unremarkable disk of white. But for a few short weeks in the summer, when the sun is strong enough to melt the ice, the lake reveals its secret. As the ice recedes, you see them. First one, then another. Skulls, femurs, ribs, vertebrae. The shallow, crystal-clear water is littered with human bones. As you walk around the shore, you see hundreds more, tangled in the rocky soil. This is Rupkund, known to the world as Skeleton Lake. For decades, the question has been, who were these people, and how did they all die here, in this remote and unforgiving place? The first official investigation came in the 1940s, after a British forest guard stumbled upon the gruesome scene. The initial theory was compelling, dramatic, and seemed to fit the evidence perfectly. Many of the skulls had short, deep cracks on the top, suggesting death by blunt force trauma from above. This, combined with a local folk song that told the story of a furious goddess striking down a group of disrespectful pilgrims with iron balls thrown from the sky, led to a powerful conclusion. These people were all killed in a single, freakishly violent hailstorm. You can almost picture it, a large group, caught in the open with no shelter, as hailstones the size of cricket balls rained down upon them. It was a neat, tidy, and terrifying explanation. This theory was bolstered by a mainstream historical fact. The lake lies near the route of the Nanda Devi Raj Jat, a major Hindu pilgrimage that happens only once every 12 years, bringing large groups of people into this dangerous, high-altitude terrain. A pilgrimage gone wrong seemed like the most logical answer. The story was so good, it was considered solved for over 50 years. But science, as it so often does, came along and made things beautifully, frustratingly complicated. A landmark 2019 genetic study completely shattered the hailstorm theory. Scientists analyzed the DNA from 38 of the skeletons, and the results turned a single, simple tragedy into a complex, multi-layered enigma. This is the scientific evidence that changed everything. The skeletons did not belong to one group of people. They belonged to at least 3 genetically distinct populations who died at vastly different times. The first group, and the largest, was of South Asian ancestry, consistent with local Indian populations. But they didn't die recently. They died around 800 AD, a full 1,000 years earlier than anyone expected. The second group was even more baffling. Genetically, they were from the Eastern Mediterranean, people whose DNA most closely matched that of modern-day Greeks and Cretans. They died much more recently, around 1800 AD. And as if that weren't strange enough, there was a third individual of Southeast Asian ancestry who also died around 1800 AD. This discovery doesn't just muddy the waters, it throws the entire mystery wide open. This discovery deepens the mystery rather than solving it. What were Mediterranean people doing in such a remote Himalayan lake in the 19th century? How did all three groups meet their end in the exact same spot, centuries apart? The hailstorm theory can't account for it all. A single catastrophic hailstorm is plausible. Two or more, separated by 1,000 years, that just happened to kill large groups of people in the exact same tiny hollow, strains credulity to its breaking point. The perfect preservation of the remains adds another layer to the story. This is our quirky tidbit. It's not a supernatural phenomenon. The extreme cold, low humidity, and rarefied air at that altitude essentially freeze-dried the bodies, preserving flesh, hair, and bone for centuries in the icy water, waiting for the summer thaw to offer them up to the sky. Rupkund is no longer the site of a single tragic event. It is a place of repeating, unsolved death. It's a geographical magnet for calamity. Did these groups all die from different causes? Disease? Weather? Getting lost? Or is there some unknown, recurring environmental hazard in this specific spot? The lake holds its secrets tight, offering up only its silent, enigmatic bones. It is a stark reminder that even with our most advanced science, some places on Earth remain profoundly and stubbornly mysterious, their stories layered so deep in time that we may never fully unravel them. But while Rupkund's story is one of accidental death and natural preservation, some cultures would turn the act of preservation itself into a national, spiritual, and scientific obsession. The skeletons of Rupkund Lake are a testament to the power of nature to preserve the dead, a chilling accident of climate and geography. But what happens when that preservation is no longer an accident? What happens when a civilization becomes so utterly obsessed with defying death that they turn the process of preservation into a national industry, a sacred art, and a bizarre, intricate science? We now travel to the hot, dry sands of ancient Egypt to witness the ultimate expression of the human refusal to let go. You are standing in an embalmer's workshop on the west bank of the Nile, a place the Egyptians called the Wabet, or the pure place. The air is thick with the scent of incense, fragrant oils, and something else, something cloying and chemical. A body lies on a stone table. This is not a scene of mourning. It's a scene of technical, spiritual work. The goal here is not to prepare a body for burial, but to transform a mortal vessel of flesh into an eternal home for the soul. The first step is arguably the most unsettling. You watch as an embalmer takes a long bronze hook, not much different from a crochet needle. He inserts it into the deceased's nostril, pushing it up until it breaks through the thin ethmoid bone and into the cranial cavity. Then, with a practiced churning motion, he begins to liquefy the brain. He pulls out what he can with the hook, and the rest, now a semi-liquid slurry, is drained out through the nose by turning the body on its side. To the Egyptians, the brain was just stuffing. It produced mucus. The heart was the seat of intelligence, emotion, and memory. The brain was simply discarded. Next, a sharp obsidian knife is used to make a small incision in the left side of the abdomen. The embalmer reaches inside and one by one removes the internal organs. The liver, the lungs, the stomach, and the intestines. The heart, the precious center of the self, is carefully left in place, as it would be needed for judgment in the afterlife. The organs that were removed are not thrown away. They are cleaned, dried, and placed into 4 special containers called canopic jars, each with a lid representing one of the 4 sons of the god Horus, to protect them for eternity. Now comes the crucial stage of preservation. The empty body cavity is washed with palm wine and spices, and then the entire body is covered in a mountain of natron, a natural salt harvested from the dry lake beds. This is our mainstream historical fact. The body would remain buried in this dehydrating salt for 40 days, until every drop of moisture was pulled from the tissues. After 40 days, the body, now a shrunken, leathery, but perfectly preserved husk, was removed, cleaned, and prepared for the final 30 days of wrapping. The entire process, from start to finish, took exactly 70 days. This elaborate, almost fanatical process was driven by a complex theology. The Egyptians believed a person's soul had multiple parts, including the ka, life force, and the be, which would need to reunite with the physical body in the afterlife to become an immortal ak. If the body decayed, the soul would be homeless, lost for eternity. The mummy was not just a preserved corpse, it was a necessary piece of spiritual hardware, and modern science has allowed us to read these bodies like ancient books. The scientific evidence gathered from CT scans and X-rays of mummies is a treasure trove of information. We have diagnosed diseases like arthritis, polio, and tuberculosis. We have found evidence of clogged arteries, revealing that heart disease isn't just a modern problem. We've even been able to determine the cause of death for pharaohs like Ramesses III, who had his throat slit in a palace conspiracy. Egyptologists still debate the evolution of mummification. Did it arise from observing natural mummification in the hot desert sand, or was it a purely theological innovation that became more scientific over millennia? The earliest Egyptians were buried in simple sand pits, where the hot, dry conditions created natural mummies. Did they simply try to replicate and improve upon this natural process as burial customs became more elaborate? Or was the idea born entirely from their religious beliefs about the soul? The obsession was not limited to humans, which brings us to a truly bizarre, quirky tidbit. Animal mummification was a massive industry. Archaeologists have discovered entire catacombs filled with literally millions of mummified animals. Cats, ibis, crocodiles, baboons, and even beetles. These weren't beloved pets being buried with their owners. They were mass-produced votive offerings, created to carry a pilgrim's prayer to the gods. You would go to a temple, buy a pre-mummified cat, and offer it to the cat goddess Bastet. It was a strange intersection of piety and commerce. In one instance, embalmers working on a pharaoh accidentally discarded his heart and had to fashion a replacement out of resin and a scarab beetle to ensure he could still pass his final judgment. No pressure. Ultimately, Egyptian mummification is perhaps the most elaborate, expensive, and scientifically ambitious form of insanity our species has ever devised to deal with death. It's a complete and total rejection of the natural process of decay, a multi-generational project to build a bridge of flesh into eternity. But what happens when our collective obsessions are not with the dead, but with the living, and are aimed not at the heavens, but at the earth itself? The elaborate science of Egyptian mummification was an obsession directed inwards, a society-wide project to conquer the decay of the individual body. But human obsession can also be directed outwards, exploding into monumental constructions that require the coordinated labor of hundreds, if not thousands, of people. We now journey to a time long before the pharaohs, before the first city, before even the invention of the farmer's plow, to a place that should not exist. A testament to a collective vision so powerful it feels like a beautiful, organized madness. Let your mind drift back, much further this time. You are in the rolling hills of southeastern Turkey, 11,600 years ago. The last ice age has just ended. The world is populated by small, nomadic bands of hunter-gatherers. They have no permanent villages, no domesticated animals to carry heavy loads, no pottery to store food, and certainly no metal tools. Their entire existence is a constant, rhythmic search for wild game and edible plants. By all the rules of history we thought we knew, these people should have been incapable of large-scale, organized construction. And yet, on a rounded hilltop the locals call Göbekli Tepe, or Pot-Belly Hill, they built a cathedral. As you approach the summit, you see them. Not houses, not shelters, but a series of massive circular enclosures sunk into the earth. At the center of each circle and embedded in the surrounding walls are enormous T-shaped pillars of limestone. The largest of these pillars are over 18 feet tall and weigh an estimated 10 to 20 tons. Imagine the sheer brute force effort. These megaliths were quarried from a nearby limestone bed, carved with nothing more than flint and obsidian tools, and then somehow transported and lifted into place by people with no wheels, no pulleys, and no beasts of burden. Just human muscle, rope, and an almost inconceivable level of shared purpose. And these are not blank stones. Their surfaces are covered in intricate, stylized carvings of animals. You see menacing-looking boars, snarling foxes, venomous snakes coiling up the sides, and vultures with massive wingspans. This is not simple graffiti. It is a complex, symbolic world. A Stone Age Sistine chapel teeming with powerful, perhaps terrifying creatures. The sheer age of this place is staggering, and it stands as our mainstream historical fact. Göbekli Tepe is the oldest known megalithic structure in the world. It is more than 6,000 years older than Stonehenge, and 7,000 years older than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Its existence is an archaeological miracle, a complete anomaly in the story of human civilization. So who lived here? The answer, revealed by decades of painstaking excavation, is perhaps the most shocking part of the story. The scientific evidence is clear. Nobody did. Archaeologists have found no signs of permanent habitation. No domestic hearths, no houses, no garbage pits associated with daily life. What they have found are mountains of animal bones, gazelles, aurochs, wild boar, all butchered and cooked in enormous quantities. This wasn't a town. It was a place of pilgrimage, a ritual center where different clans of hunter-gatherers would travel vast distances to meet, to feast, and most importantly, to build. This discovery didn't just add a new chapter to our history. It forced us to tear up the entire book and start again. And that brings us to the profound, open, scholarly debate it ignited. For a century, the standard model of civilization was simple. First, humans invented agriculture. This allowed them to produce surplus food, which led to permanent settlements. These villages grew into towns and cities, and only then, with a stable population and a food surplus, did society have the luxury of developing complex religion, art, and monumental architecture. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe completely upended this theory. Archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, the original excavator, famously argued it was the other way around. First came the temple, then the city. The intense, shared need to build and gather for ritual may have been the very catalyst for the invention of agriculture. Building these massive structures and feeding the hundreds of workers required a stable food source that hunting and gathering could no longer provide. The hunger of the gods, it seems, may have given birth to the farmer. And then, after more than 1,000 years of continuous building and use, the people of Göbekli Tepe did something just as inexplicable as building it in the first place. This is our final baffling, quirky tidbit. They deliberately buried the entire site. Over the course of several generations, they filled in the magnificent stone circles with tons of dirt, rock, and animal bones, creating the artificial hill that preserved it perfectly for the next 10,000 years. We have no idea why. Did their religion change? Were they hiding it from a new enemy? Or was this the final, ultimate ritual act to entomb their sacred place forever? Göbekli Tepe is a monument to the power of a shared idea. It is perhaps the first great act of collective insanity in human history. The decision to pour unimaginable resources and effort into a project with no practical, utilitarian purpose. It was not for shelter, not for defense, but for something far more abstract and powerful, a connection to the cosmos. But if this was a message carved in stone for the gods, other ancient peoples would create messages on an even grander scale, meant to be seen only from the heavens. The builders of Göbekli Tepe poured their collective energy into a temple of stone, a sacred space meant for people to gather on the ground. But what if the audience for your devotion isn't on the ground at all? What if the gods you are trying to reach are in the sky? In that case, you don't build up, you spread out. You turn the very surface of the earth into a message board, a colossal work of art meant to be seen only from a perspective you yourself can never achieve. Our journey takes us now from the hills of Turkey to the vast, bone-dry desert plains of southern Peru. You are floating high above the ground, looking down on a landscape that seems like a giant, dusty sketchpad. Etched across the reddish-brown desert floor are hundreds of lines, geometric shapes, and enormous figures. This is the home of the Nazca Lines, one of the most enigmatic and visually stunning creations in human history. From your vantage point, you can see them clearly. There is a spider, its form so biologically accurate you can identify the species. There is a hummingbird, its wings forever hovering over a flower. A monkey with a spiraling prehensile tail. A lizard, a fish, a condor with 100-foot wingspan. These are not small drawings. Some of these figures, or geoglyphs, are longer than a football field. They are interspersed with immense trapezoids, triangles, and perfectly straight lines that run for miles across the desert, ignoring hills and valleys as if drawn with a giant cosmic ruler. Now, drift down to the ground. The magic vanishes. The grand designs dissolve into nothing more than shallow pathways in the dirt. You realize how they were made. The Nazca people, between 500 BC and 500 AD, created these images through a deceptively simple process. They just removed the dark, rust-colored pebbles that litter the desert surface, exposing the lighter, sandy soil underneath. In a wetter, windier climate, these lines would have vanished in a single season. But here, in one of the driest places on Earth, they have survived. And this is our mainstream historical fact. The Nazca lines were preserved for nearly 2 millennia thanks to the region's incredibly stable, dry, and windless climate, combined with the protective layer of the desert pavement itself. This brings us to the central, baffling mystery. Why would a culture invest so much time and effort into creating colossal images that they themselves could never see in their entirety? There were no airplanes, no hot air balloons. The full effect of their work was reserved for the sky gods, the mountain spirits, or perhaps no one at all. For decades, theories have swirled around this question. Were the lines a giant astronomical calendar, with the straight lines aligning to the solstice, the equinox, or the rising and setting of significant stars? This was one of the earliest and most popular scientific theories. Or perhaps they were not meant to be seen from above, but to be walked upon. Maybe they were ceremonial pathways, with different clans or families processing along the lines of their totem animal during religious rituals. The scientific evidence on the ground seems to support this second idea. Archaeologists excavating the sites have found the remains of small wooden stakes at key geometric points, likely used for surveying and laying out the designs. They have also found broken pottery at the intersections of lines and at the ends of figures, suggesting that offerings were made at these locations. It paints a picture of ground-based ritual, of people walking the sacred paths of the hummingbird or the spider to connect with the spiritual world. More recently, hydrologists have pointed out a striking correlation between many of the lines and the location of underground water sources, suggesting the rituals may have been desperate appeals for water in an unforgiving environment. Of course, when you have a mystery this grand, you're bound to get some more creative explanations. And this brings us to our quirky tidbit. In the 1960s and 70s, a Swiss author named Erich von Däniken popularized the idea that the Nazca lines were nothing less than landing strips for ancient alien spacecraft. The idea captured the public imagination and became a cornerstone of ancient astronaut theories. While it's a fun thought, it has been thoroughly debunked by archaeologists who have shown how the lines could be, and were, created with the simple technology available to the Nazca people. And so, the real debate continues. While the alien landing strip idea is fantasy, the core debate remains. Were the lines primarily for astronomical purposes, for water-finding rituals, or simply as a monumental expression of clan identity? The truth is likely a combination of all three. It's not a single answer question. These were complex creations for a complex society, likely serving multiple functions over the hundreds of years they were being made and maintained. The Nazca lines represent a form of collective human effort that is both beautiful and deeply insane. It's the act of meticulously creating something you will never see, a message whispered to the heavens on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend. It is an act of pure faith, turning the desert itself into a sacred text. And this human capacity for collective belief, for being swept up in a shared idea, can lead to monumental art. But sometimes it can lead to something far more chaotic and frightening, a madness of the mind that is dangerously contagious. The Nazca lines and Göbekli Tepe are monuments to the constructive power of a shared belief. They show humanity's ability to organize, to cooperate, and to pour generations of effort into a single, grand vision. But the human mind, when gathered in a crowd, has a strange and volatile chemistry. Sometimes that collective energy doesn't build temples or draw hummingbirds in the desert. Sometimes it simply breaks. And when it breaks, it can create a spectacle of madness so profound, it feels like a waking nightmare. We leave the quiet, sun-scorched plains of Peru and travel to the bustling, crowded streets of Strasbourg, in the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, in the summer of 1518. You are in a narrow cobblestone alley, It is a time of immense hardship. The people are suffering from famine after a series of brutal winters and scorching summers. Diseases like syphilis and leprosy are rampant, and a new wave of religious fervor and superstition is sweeping through Europe. The psychological pressure on the community is at a breaking point. And then, one day in July, a woman named Frau Trophea steps out of her house and into the street. And she begins to dance. There is no music. Her movements are jerky, convulsive. It is not a dance of joy. Her face is a mask of anguish. But she does not stop. She dances for hours until she collapses from exhaustion. She sleeps for a while, her feet swollen and bloody, and then she gets up and begins to dance again. She continues this for nearly a week. At first, it is a local curiosity, a poor woman who has lost her mind. But then, something strange happens. One of her neighbors joins her, then another. Within a week, there are more than 30 people dancing in the streets, unable to stop. The phenomenon is spreading like a virus. By the time a month has passed, the crowd of dancers has swelled to 400. This is not a myth or a folk tale. Our mainstream historical fact is that the dancing plague of 1518 is a thoroughly documented historical event. We have records from the city council, from the local church, and from physicians of the time, all describing the bizarre and horrifying phenomenon. The authorities were completely baffled. Believing the dancers were suffering from hot blood, their physicians prescribed the only remedy they could think of: more dancing. They reasoned that the afflicted had to dance the fever out. They cleared out the guild halls to create dance floors. They built a large wooden stage in the middle of the grain market. And they even hired professional musicians to play pipes and drums to keep the people moving. This brings us to the central, tragic, quirky tidbit. The authorities' well-intentioned cure was the worst possible thing they could have done. Instead of helping, they legitimized and amplified the hysteria, turning a strange outbreak into a full-blown public spectacle. The horror was unimaginable. These people were not having fun. They were trapped in their own bodies, their limbs flailing against their will. They screamed in pain and terror, begging for help as they danced on blistered, bleeding feet. And day by day, they began to die. From heart attacks, from strokes, from sheer, relentless exhaustion. What could cause such a thing? For a long time, the leading theory was ergotism. Ergo is a fungus that grows on damp rye, and when baked into bread, it can cause convulsions, hallucinations, and muscle spasms. However, most modern historians have dismissed this theory, as many of the symptoms of ergotism don't match the reports, and it's unlikely that so many people would have the exact same coordinated reaction. The most widely accepted explanation today is a phenomenon known as mass psychogenic illness, or mass hysteria. The scientific evidence for this is not in the ground, but in the field of modern psychology. We know that under conditions of extreme and prolonged stress, the human mind can snap, triggering physical symptoms with no organic cause. This psychological breakdown can then spread through a vulnerable population via social contagion, like a psychic flu. We've seen modern, if less lethal, examples like the Tanganyika laughter epidemic of 1962, where a fit of laughter in a school spread to over 1,000 people, forcing the school to close. But even if we accept this diagnosis, a question remains. Historians and psychologists still argue about the trigger. Was it a specific religious belief about a saint? Saint Vitus, who was said to be able to inflict a dancing curse on sinners? Or was it a more general stress-induced psychosis that simply took the form of dancing? we may never know the precise thought that sparked the madness. The dancing plague of Strasbourg is a terrifying example of the fragility of the human mind. It shows how a combination of fear, stress, and superstition can create a feedback loop that drives hundreds of people into a state of collective, and in this case, lethal, insanity. It is a vivid reminder that sometimes the most dangerous place to be is inside a crowd, where the strange beliefs of one person can become the terrifying reality of all. And if humans can be so suggestible in a crowd, what happens when we start treating animals as if they have the same moral and rational minds as we do? The dancing plague of Strasbourg shows us a terrifying picture of the human mind losing control, of hundreds of people becoming slaves to a bizarre, uncontrollable impulse. It was a moment when rational thought dissolved into chaos. But the human mind is a strange and contradictory thing. At the very same time in history, in that very same part of the world, our species was engaging in an activity that was the polar opposite of this chaos. It was an act of hyper-rationality, of legalistic obsession so extreme, so methodical, and so utterly insane that it almost defies belief. We are entering the world of the animal trial. Imagine you are in a crowded courtroom in 14th century France. The air is heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies and damp stone. A judge, in his full, solemn robes, sits on a high-backed chair. A prosecutor is making his case with fiery rhetoric. A defense attorney is preparing his counter-arguments. And in the dock, looking thoroughly unimpressed by the whole affair, is the accused. A pig. This is not a joke. This is not a village pantomime. This is a formal, legally binding secular court proceeding. And our mainstream historical fact is that for nearly 1,000 years, from the 9th to the 19th century, animal trials were a real and surprisingly common practice across Europe. We have extensive court records, meticulously detailing the charges, the arguments, and the sentences, all carried out with the full gravity of the law. The process was a perfect mirror of a human trial. If a pig was accused of a crime, most often the horrific act of injuring or killing a child in a village, it would be formally arrested and taken to the local jail, where it would be held in a cell, often at the town's expense. The court would then appoint a lawyer for the pig's defense, and these lawyers often took their jobs very seriously. They would present evidence, argue points of law, and try to win an acquittal for their client. The prosecution would call witnesses, the judge and jury would listen to the arguments, and a verdict would be reached. The crimes varied. Pigs were the most common defendants in secular courts due to their free-roaming nature in medieval villages. But horses, donkeys, dogs, and bulls also stood trial for assault or murder. Ecclesiastical, or church, courts handled a different class of criminal. Pests. Swarms of locusts, weevils, or rats that destroyed crops would be put on trial in absentia. The church would send a representative to the afflicted field, read out the charges, and give the pests a deadline to leave the area or face a sentence of eternal damnation. Because, of course, that's what's stopping a locust. The threat of excommunication. If found guilty, the sentence for the larger animals was almost always death. The animal would be taken to the public square and executed, usually by hanging or being burned at the stake. In a final surreal touch, the condemned animal was often dressed in human clothes for its own execution. The scientific evidence, in this case, isn't from DNA or bones, but from the legal documents themselves, the detailed court records that survived, proving that this wasn't just a folk custom, but an integrated part of the legal system. This brings us to the central, baffling question. What on earth did they think they were doing? Legal historians debate the underlying purpose of these trials. Were they a genuine belief that animals had moral culpability? A way for the community to restore a sense of moral order after a shocking event? Or a mechanism for the church and state to demonstrate their authority over all of God's creation, even the unruly parts? Did they truly believe a pig could have criminal intent, a concept we call mens rea? Or was this a form of community therapy, a way to process a terrible tragedy by putting it through the familiar, comforting ritual of the legal process? By executing the pig, they weren't just killing an animal, they were purging the community of the crime itself. The seriousness with which these proceedings were taken gives us our wonderfully quirky tidbit. In one famous 16th century case in France, a group of rats were put on trial for destroying the local barley harvest. Their defense attorney, a brilliant young lawyer named Bartholomew Chassenet, argued that his clients could not possibly appear in court. Firstly, he said, the summons was too specific, addressing only the rats of one village, while his clients were part of a wider regional rat community. But his masterstroke was his second argument. He claimed his clients feared for their lives, as the court was known to be frequented by malicious and evil-intentioned cats, and therefore they could not be guaranteed safe passage to the proceedings. He won his case, and the trial was postponed. The practice of animal trials reveals a worldview so different from our own. It was a world where the legal and moral framework of humanity was seen as universal, a system so perfect it could be projected onto the entire animal kingdom. It's an insane level of anthropomorphism, a bizarre fusion of human logic and a complete misunderstanding of the natural world. It's a testament to our species' obsession with order, with rules, with process. An obsession so profound that we were willing to prosecute a pig for murder. And this deep desire to find order, to understand the hidden rules of the universe, would eventually lead us away from the courtroom and into the laboratory, where a new kind of insanity was just beginning to brew. The strange formal logic of the animal trials shows a world desperately trying to impose human order onto a chaotic, natural world. It was a dead end, a beautiful absurdity. But that same human drive, the obsession with finding hidden rules, with understanding the deep structure of reality, would lead us away from the courtroom and into a new kind of space, the laboratory. Here, a new kind of investigator, the alchemist, would try to unlock the secrets of the universe, driven by a philosophy that was part science, part magic, and entirely insane. Forget the cartoon image of a wizard in a pointy hat, cackling over a bubbling cauldron. You are now in the dimly lit workshop of a 17th century alchemist. This is not a place of spells, but of intense, often dangerous experimentation. The air is thick with the acrid smell of sulfur, vinegar, and stranger things. Shelves are crowded with oddly shaped glass vessels. Alembics for distillation, curved retorts, squat pelican flasks. This is the ancestor of the modern chemistry lab, and the person working here is not a sorcerer, but a philosopher of nature, a proto-scientist. His goal is twofold, and both parts are impossibly grand. On one level, he is trying to achieve the magnum opus, the great work, the transmutation of a base metal, like lead, into pure, perfect gold. But this was not just about getting rich. For the true alchemist, the transformation of matter was inextricably linked to the transformation of the soul. To purify lead into gold was to mirror the process of purifying one's own spirit, casting off sin and imperfection to achieve a state of grace. The ultimate prize was not just a pile of gold, but the creation of the philosopher's stone, a mythical substance that could grant eternal life. It was a worldview where physics and metaphysics were the same thing. This obsession was not the domain of crackpots and charlatans, though there were plenty of those. This is our mainstream historical fact. Some of the greatest minds in history were deeply, obsessively immersed in alchemy. Sir Isaac Newton, the man who gave us the laws of motion and universal gravitation, the father of modern physics, was also a fanatical alchemist. He wrote over 1 million words on the subject, far more than he ever wrote on physics or optics, filling notebooks with cryptic recipes and esoteric symbols in his secret quest for the philosopher's stone. The alchemist's worldview was based on a different set of rules. They believed all matter was composed of 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water, and 3 essential principles: sulfur, the principle of inflammability; mercury, the principle of fluidity and fusibility; and salt, the principle of solidity. By changing the balance of these principles within a metal, they believed they could change the metal itself. This theoretical framework was, of course, completely wrong. And yet, this is where the genius lies within the madness. Here is the crucial scientific evidence. In their relentless, misguided quest, alchemists became masters of empirical experimentation. They were the ones who invented and perfected the fundamental techniques of chemistry: distillation, sublimation, crystallization. These are the bedrock procedures of a modern lab, and they were all refined in the alchemist's fire. In their attempts to create gold, they accidentally discovered and isolated a host of new elements and compounds, from arsenic and antimony to sulfuric acid. Their flawed paradigm led to brilliant, world-changing discoveries. One story perfectly captures this beautiful, insane serendipity. This is our quirky tidbit. In 1669, a German alchemist named Hennig Brand was convinced he could extract the spirit of life from a golden substance, human urine. He embarked on a truly epic project, collecting hundreds and hundreds of gallons of it, which he then allowed to putrefy before boiling it down to a thick paste. He heated this paste to an extreme temperature, and as the fumes cooled and condensed in his retort, he was left with a strange, white, waxy substance. It had one incredible property: it glowed in the dark. He had failed to make gold, but he had become the first person in history to discover and isolate a new element: phosphorus, the light bringer. This is the legacy of alchemy, a history of failing spectacularly, and in doing so, stumbling upon the truth. Newton's deep involvement remains a fascinating puzzle for scholars. Historians of science argue over Newton's deep involvement in alchemy. Was it a lapse in his scientific judgment? Or was his alchemical worldview of hidden forces acting at a distance essential to his revolutionary concept of universal gravitation? Did his belief in the hidden spiritual sympathies between objects in his lab prime his mind to accept the idea of a hidden, invisible force like gravity acting between planets? Alchemy represents a crucial bridge between the ancient magical world and our modern scientific one. It was a form of sane insanity, an obsession based on a false premise that nonetheless led to real, tangible knowledge. It was a necessary, if bizarre, step in our long, stumbling journey to understand what the world is made of. And as we will see, this same mix of brilliant insight and profound misunderstanding would soon be applied not to metals, but to the world of medicine, with even stranger results. The alchemist in his lab, for all his esoteric beliefs, was at his core an experimenter. He was trying to force nature to reveal its secrets through fire and distillation. But at the very same time, the world of medicine was often guided by a principle that was far less experimental and far more poetic. It was an idea that saw the entire natural world as a divinely written prescription, a cosmic pharmacy where the cure for every ailment was hidden in plain sight, if only you knew how to look. This was the doctrine of signatures. Imagine you are an apprentice to a physician in the 16th century. Your master is a learned man. He has read the works of the ancient Greeks and the latest medical treatises. But his most fundamental diagnostic tool is not a scalpel or a microscope. It's an analogy. The core idea is simple, elegant, and utterly mad. God, in his infinite wisdom, wanted to help humanity. So he left clues or signatures in the appearance of plants to show us what they were meant to cure. The medicine simply had to look like the body part or the ailment it was intended to treat. Your master takes you on a walk through the forest, and it becomes a living lesson. He cracks open a walnut. "You see," he says, pointing to the wrinkled, bilobed kernel. "It is a perfect little brain. Therefore, walnuts must be used to treat afflictions of the head." He points to a small, delicate flower with a dark spot in its center, making it look like a tiny, bloodshot eye. "That," he proclaims, "is eyebright. It is God's chosen remedy for infections of the eye. He shows you the liver-shaped leaves of the hepatica plant, the obvious cure for jaundice and other liver complaints. He pulls up a plant with a long, winding root. "Snake root," he says with confidence. "The signature is clear." It is the antidote for snakebite. This was the lens through which they saw the world, a grand, divine scavenger hunt for meaning. And this is our mainstream historical fact. The doctrine of signatures was not a fringe folk belief. It was a central and respected tenet of Western medicine for centuries. It was championed by influential physicians like Paracelsus and was included in official medical texts and pharmacopoeias, the standard reference books for apothecaries. It was, for a very long time, simply how medicine worked. The insanity lies in the fact that this system was based on nothing more than visual coincidence, a form of medical pareidolia. And yet, and this is a crucial point, it sometimes worked. The scientific evidence, when we look back with modern chemistry, reveals that a few of these signatures were happy accidents. The doctrine acted as a justification for remedies that had already been discovered through generations of trial and error. For example, the bark of the willow tree, which grows in damp places and has long, flexible branches reminiscent of arthritic limbs, was used to treat pain and inflammation. We now know that willow bark contains salicin, the natural compound from which we derive aspirin. The signature didn't lead to the discovery, but it provided a memorable and seemingly logical reason for why an existing folk remedy was effective. Of course, the folklore surrounding these signature plants could take on a life of its own. This brings us to the most famous and theatrical example, the quirky tidbit of the mandrake root. Because the root of the mandrake plant can sometimes grow in a forked shape, vaguely resembling a human figure, it was considered one of the most powerful plants in the pharmacopoeia. It was believed to hold immense magical and medicinal power, but harvesting it was incredibly dangerous. According to legend, when a mandrake was pulled from the earth, it would let out a blood-curdling scream so powerful it would kill any human who heard it. Therefore, a complex ritual was required. You would loosen the soil around the plant, tie a rope from the root to the neck of a dog, and then, from a safe distance, call the dog. The dog would pull the root from the ground, die from the scream and leave the harvester with the precious and now safe mandrake. This mix of poetic logic and outright fantasy makes for a compelling story, but it also leads to a key question. Historians argue whether the doctrine of signatures was a genuine attempt at a rational system based on divine pattern matching, or if it was simply a mnemonic device, a way to remember and pass down folk knowledge about herbal remedies in a pre-literate world. Was it easier to remember that the toothwort plant was good for toothaches because its root looked like a molar? Or did they truly believe they were reading the mind of God in the shape of a leaf? The doctrine of signatures reveals a human mind desperate to find meaning, to see patterns and divine intention in the chaos of the natural world. It's a beautiful, holistic, and deeply flawed way of thinking, a reminder that the path to true scientific understanding is often littered with such poetic and dangerously wrong ideas. But if you think a telepathic connection between a plant and a body part is strange, just wait until you hear about the 19th century belief in a telepathic connection between snails. The doctrine of signatures was born from a belief in a divinely ordered world, a place where the connection between a plant and a person was written in the language of poetry and visual rhyme. But as we move into the 19th century, the world is changing. The old spiritual worldview is giving way to a new scientific one, and this new world is filled with invisible forces that seem every bit as magical as God's signatures. Electricity, magnetism, gravity. These were mysterious, unseen energies that could move objects and transmit information across distances. In this exciting, confusing new landscape, the line between groundbreaking science and utter insanity became very, very blurry. You are in Paris in the year 1850. The city is buzzing with new inventions and radical ideas. The electric telegraph is a recent marvel, a miracle of the modern age. But some believe there are other, more organic ways to communicate instantly over vast distances. Enter Jacques Toussaint Benoit de Leroux, a French occultist and inventor with a theory so strange it makes listening to plants seem perfectly reasonable. His idea was based on what he called the Escar rapport. He claimed that snails, after making physical contact, form a permanent and unbreakable psychic bond. An invisible, ethereal fluid connects them for the rest of their lives, no matter how far apart they are. He believed that if you stimulated one snail, its bonded partner would react instantly, sympathetically, through this mysterious fluid. He had discovered, he claimed, biological telepathy. Based on this principle, he constructed a device he called the Passilolinic sympathetic compass, which is just a fancy way of saying the snail telegraph. Picture the contraption: a large wooden frame with a series of zinc bowls. In each bowl sits a single snail. There are 26 of them, one for each letter of the alphabet. At the sending station, the operator has his 26 snails. At the receiving station, miles away, sits an identical apparatus with the 26 bonded partners. To send a message, the operator would gently poke the snail in the H bowl. Instantly, at the receiving station, the H snail would twitch and extend its horns, alerting the operator to the letter. By spelling out words, snail by snail, you could have a real-time, silent, and apparently slimy conversation. Now it's easy for us to laugh, but you have to remember the context. If a scientist could send a message down a wire using an invisible electrical force, was it really so much more of a stretch to believe that nature had its own biological version of the same thing? The idea was taken seriously enough to attract significant attention. And this is our mainstream historical fact. The snail telegraph was not just a private fantasy. Benoit managed to convince a prominent Parisian journalist and manager of the Odeon Theatre, a man named Jules Alix, of his theory. Alix became a passionate advocate for the invention, and in October of 1850, a public demonstration was arranged to prove its efficacy once and for all. The demonstration was a public event. Benoit would send a message from a room on one side of Paris, while Alix would wait with the receiving snails in another room, ready to transcribe the psychic message for the eager audience. The moment of truth arrived. Benoit began his work, diligently poking his snails in the correct sequence. But on the other side of town, Alix stared intently at his own panel of snails. And nothing happened. The snails remained stubbornly still, presumably thinking about lettuce, or whatever it is snails think about, completely unmoved by the frantic psychic emanations of their distant partners. Benoit later made a flurry of excuses. The weather was wrong. One of the snails was sick. There was too much atmospheric interference. The project became a laughingstock, and the snail telegraph was relegated to the footnotes of history as one of its most gloriously insane failures. This wasn't the only idea of its kind, which brings us to our quirky tidbit. A similar earlier concept was the sympathetic telegraph, which proposed taking two compass needles that had been rubbed on the exact same lodestone. The theory was that these needles would also form a permanent bond, and if you pointed one at a letter on a dial, the other, even miles away, would swing to point at the same letter. It's the same flawed logic, just replacing biology with magnetism. What this bizarre episode reveals is something historians of pseudoscience often note. New scientific breakthroughs create a halo effect. A genuine, world-changing discovery like electromagnetism makes people so receptive to new possibilities that they temporarily lose the ability to distinguish between the plausible and the preposterous. The language of invisible force, sympathetic vibrations, and ethereal fluids sounded so scientific, so cutting-edge, that it could make even the most ridiculous idea seem like it was just on the cusp of the next great discovery. It's the 19th century version of someone putting the word quantum in front of a product to make it sound more legitimate. The snail telegraph is a perfect monument to this phenomenon. It is a testament to the human capacity for wishful thinking, and a hilarious reminder that for every genuine scientific leap forward, there is often a corresponding and much more comical leap off the deep end. And this tendency to dress up strange ideas in the clothing of science would lead to even more disturbing conclusions when we stopped trying to read the minds of snails and started trying to read the minds of people by measuring the bumps on their heads. The snail telegraph was a spectacular failure, a flash in the pan of inspired lunacy that was quickly and rightly laughed off the stage. But not all pseudosciences are so harmless or so easily dismissed. Some come dressed in the full authoritative robes of medicine and anatomy. They offer not just a quirky gadget, but a complete system for understanding the most complex thing in the universe, the human personality. And for a time, the Western world fell completely under the spell of one such science, a discipline that promised to read your character, your talents, and your darkest impulses simply by feeling the bumps on your head. This was the age of phrenology. You are in a lavishly decorated parlor in London, or perhaps a lecture hall in Boston, sometime in the 1840s. A man, the phrenologist, stands on a stage. He is a figure of immense confidence and scientific authority. He calls for a volunteer from the audience. He has you sit in a chair, and he begins his examination. He doesn't ask you questions. He doesn't need to. He simply places his long, sensitive fingers on your scalp and begins a slow, methodical exploration of your skull. His hands move with practiced ease, probing, measuring with calipers, and occasionally making a note on a chart. "Ah," he says, his fingers pressing just behind your ear. "The organ of destructiveness is quite pronounced. You have a temper, a certain aggressive energy." Then his hands move to the crown of your head. "But look here. Veneration and benevolence are very well developed. You are a deeply moral and kind-hearted person, respectful of tradition." He continues this way, mapping your entire personality. Your love for your children, philoprogenitiveness, your tendency to save money, acquisitiveness, your sense of humor, mirthfulness. It all feels remarkably specific, deeply personal, and to you and the captivated audience, incredibly scientific. This was the theory, first developed by a German physician named Franz Joseph Gall in the 1790s. It was based on a few core ideas. First, the brain is not a single unified organ, but a collection of distinct mental faculties or organs. Gall initially identified 27 of them. Second, the size of each of these brain organs is a direct measure of its power. If your organ of amativeness was large, you were a passionate, romantic person. If it was small, you were not. And third, and this was the crucial leap of faith, the skull was believed to ossify directly over the brain, so the physical shape of your skull, its bumps and ridges, was a perfect external map of your internal mental landscape. This idea was a sensation. Our mainstream historical fact is that phrenology became wildly popular in the 19th century, evolving from a medical theory into a massive cultural phenomenon. People would go to a phrenologist before hiring an employee, before choosing a spouse, or to get advice on what career their children should pursue. Intricate ceramic heads, marked with the locations of all the mental faculties, became common fixtures in studies and parlors. It promised a simple, physical, and seemingly scientific answer to the messy, invisible questions of human nature. The only problem, of course, is that it was complete and utter nonsense. The scientific evidence against it is absolute. First, the brain simply doesn't work that way. While certain functions are localized to specific regions, a concept phrenology ironically helped to pioneer, they are not the neat, personality-based organs Gall imagined. Second, and more damningly, the shape of the skull does not reflect the shape of the brain beneath it. The thickness of the skull varies, and there is a layer of fluid and tissue between the brain and the bone. A bump on your head has no more to do with your generosity than a bump on your elbow. The entire practice was eventually debunked by neurologists in the mid-19th century who, by studying patients with brain injuries, showed that damage to specific areas of the brain had effects that did not align with the phrenologists' maps at all. Despite its scientific failings, phrenology's popularity led to some fascinating and quirky inventions. The most notable was a device called the psychograph. This was a huge, helmet-like contraption with over 30 adjustable probes. A person would put their head inside, and the operator would lower the probes onto their scalp. The machine would then automatically measure all the bumps and, through a complex system of gears and levers, print out a customized ticker-tape report detailing the subject's entire personality profile. It was the world's first automated personality test, and it was just as meaningless as the manual version. This brings us to a complex legacy, one that is still being picked apart. Historians of science debate the legacy of phrenology. Was it a complete dead end, a dangerous pseudo-science that was used to justify racist and classist stereotypes? Or was it a crucial, if deeply flawed, proto-psychology that introduced the important concept of localization of brain function? The answer is both. Phrenology was frequently used to prove the supposed intellectual inferiority of women or non-white races, but at the same time, its insistence that the mind resides in the brain and that different parts of the brain do different things was a radical and important step away from purely philosophical or religious ideas about the soul. Phrenology is a powerful cautionary tale. It shows how easily a set of ideas, wrapped in the language of science and anatomy, can be accepted as truth. It speaks to our deep desire for simple answers, for a tidy schematic that can explain the beautiful, chaotic mess of human personality. It was a science of the surface, and like most such sciences, it was profoundly and sometimes dangerously skin-deep. This obsession with finding physical markers for internal traits, however, was just getting started. Phrenology, for all its flaws, was a relatively gentle insanity. The worst it could do was give you a bad character reference or a misguided career choice. But as we move deeper into the 19th century, we encounter a field where the science was becoming terrifyingly real. The knowledge of human anatomy was exploding, but the ability to control pain and infection was still in the dark ages. This led to a period in medicine that can only be described as the Age of Agony, a time when a trip to the surgeon was a journey into a very real and very conscious hell. You are in the operating theatre of a major London hospital, sometime around 1845. Forget the sterile, quiet, private room you imagine today. This is a theatre in the truest sense of the word. You are sitting in a steep, tiered gallery, looking down into a semicircular pit. The floor of the pit is covered in sawdust, not to be rustic, but to soak up the copious amounts of blood that will soon be spilled. The room is crowded with medical students and curious onlookers, all jostling for a better view. There is a palpable sense of anticipation, a grim, voyeuristic excitement. The patient is brought in. He is not wheeled on a gurney. He is carried or dragged by several large, muscular assistants. His eyes are wide with terror. He has a compound fracture of the leg, and gangrene has begun to set in. He knows what is coming. There is no gentle countdown, no soothing anesthetic. The only medicine he has been given is a large swig of whiskey, which will do little to dull what is about to happen. He is laid on the wooden table, and the assistants hold him down, their weight pinning his arms, his torso, and his good leg. This is the only form of restraint. The surgeon enters. He is not dressed in scrubs, but in his normal street clothes, over which he wears a frock coat stiff with the dried blood and pus of 100 previous operations. This coat is not a sign of poor hygiene. It is a badge of honor, a testament to his vast experience. And in this era, experience was measured by one thing above all else. This is our mainstream historical fact. Before the public demonstration of ether as an anesthetic in 1846, the single most important quality for a surgeon was not precision, not delicacy, but pure, unadulterated speed. The surgeon nods to his assistants. He takes the patient's leg. In one hand, he holds a gleaming amputation knife. In the other, a stopwatch. "Time me, gentlemen," he says to the gallery. And then it begins. There is a flash of steel. The first cut slices through skin and muscle in a single fluid motion. The patient's scream is not human. It is a raw, primal shriek of absolute agony that fills the theater. He thrashes against the assistants, but they hold firm. The surgeon works with a brutal, focused efficiency. He switches to a saw. The grating sound of steel on bone is sickening, a sound you feel in your own teeth. In less than 3 minutes, it is over. The leg is tossed into the sawdust. The surgeon quickly stitches the stump, his work complete. The patient, mercifully, has fainted. The anatomical knowledge was often brilliant. Surgeons knew the body inside and out. But the pain and shock were so extreme that many patients died right on the table. And for those who survived the procedure, an even greater danger awaited. The scientific evidence, gathered from hospital records of the time, shows that post-operative infection rates were astronomical. With no concept of germ theory, surgeons would move from dissecting a corpse to performing surgery without washing their hands, let alone their instruments. Sepsis, or hospital gangrene, was so common that it was often considered an unavoidable part of the healing process. More than half, and in some wards over 75%, of amputation patients would be dead within a month. The undisputed king of speed was the Scottish surgeon Robert Liston, a man who could reportedly amputate a leg in 2.5 minutes. This brings us to our quirky tidbit, a story so grim it's hard to believe. In one infamous procedure, Liston was working with his characteristic lightning speed to remove a patient's leg. In his haste, he not only cut through the leg, but also through the fingers of the young assistant who was holding it steady. As he whipped the bloody knife back, it also slashed the coattails of an elderly spectator in the gallery, who was so terrified that he dropped dead from a heart attack on the spot. The patient and the assistant both later died of infection from the unsterilized instruments. This is believed to be the only surgical procedure in history with a 300% mortality rate. This daily reality of blood and screams forces us to consider the mindset of the surgeons themselves. Medical historians debate the psychological impact of this era on the surgeons. Did they become desensitized and brutal as a coping mechanism? Or did the daily exposure to such extreme human suffering take a hidden, profound toll on their own humanity? Were these men unfeeling butchers, or were they compassionate heroes, forced to perform monstrous acts in the service of saving lives? This era represents a terrifying limbo in the history of medicine. A time when our knowledge had outpaced our technology, when we had the insane ability to cut people open, but not the mercy to make them sleep. It was a necessary, brutal chapter that makes you appreciate the profound, world-changing miracle that is anesthesia. And yet, once we had the ability to make people unconscious, it opened the door to new and even more ambitious forms of surgery, including the idea of operating not just on the body, but on the mind itself. The arrival of anesthesia was a watershed moment in human history, a blessed end to the age of surgical agony. It was a triumph of compassion and science. But this newfound ability to render a patient completely unconscious and still opened a Pandora's box of possibilities. If a surgeon could now take their time, if they no longer had to race against the patients screaming and struggling, what new frontiers could they explore? This question led them to the most complex and delicate territory of all, the human brain. And it gave rise to a procedure that stands as one of the most brutal and misguided cures in the history of medicine: the lobotomy. You are no longer in the blood-soaked theater of the 1840s. You are in a state mental asylum in America, sometime in the 1940s or 50s. The world outside is modernizing at a breakneck pace, but in here, time has stood still. The wards are horribly overcrowded, filled with hundreds of patients suffering from conditions we would now diagnose as schizophrenia, severe depression, bipolar disorder, or even just postpartum depression or teenage rebelliousness. The staff are overworked and under-resourced. There are no effective therapeutic drugs yet. The primary goal is not treatment, but containment. Families are desperate. Doctors are desperate. They are desperate for a cure, a fix, a reset button for the broken mind. Into this world of desperation steps a man named Dr. Walter Freeman. He is a charismatic, ambitious, and utterly convinced neurologist, an evangelist for a procedure first developed by the Portuguese physician Egas Moniz. The theory was that severe mental illness was caused by sticky, overactive circuits in the frontal lobes of the brain. If you could just sever those connections, you could calm the storm in the patient's mind. Moniz would go on to win the Nobel Prize for this work in 1949, but it was Freeman who would refine, popularize, and perfect the procedure into something quick, cheap, and terrifyingly efficient: the transorbital, or ice pick, lobotomy. Imagine the scene. A patient is brought into a room. There is no operating theater, no sterile field. Sometimes the procedure was done right in the ward. The patient is rendered unconscious, not with gentle gas, but with a jolt of electroconvulsive therapy. A switch is flipped, and their body convulses as the electricity seizes their brain. Then, while they are unconscious, Freeman gets to work. He takes a long, slender instrument that looks uncannily like an ice pick. It's called an orbitoclast. He gently lifts the patient's upper eyelid, exposing the top of the eyeball. He slides the point of the pick into the corner of the eye socket, between the eyeball and the lid. He pushes it in until he feels it hit the thin, delicate plate of bone that separates the eye socket from the frontal lobe of the brain. Then he takes a small mallet, and with a few sharp taps, he breaks through. The pick is now inside the patient's brain. With a swishing motion, like a bartender mixing a drink, he sweeps the instrument back and forth, severing the connections in the prefrontal cortex. He then withdraws the pick, pulls down the eyelid, and moves to the other side to repeat the process. The entire procedure takes less than 10 minutes. When the patient wakes up, they are often docile, quiet, and emotionally placid. To their desperate families and the overworked staff, it looks like a miracle. This miracle was performed on an industrial scale. Our mainstream historical fact is that over 40,000 lobotomies were performed in the United States alone, many on patients who could not give consent, including children. One of the most famous victims was Rosemary Kennedy, the sister of President John F. Kennedy. Lobotomized at the age of 23 for her moodiness and rebellious behavior, she was left with the mental capacity of a toddler and spent the rest of her life hidden from the public in an institution. The cure was, in fact, a catastrophic injury. The scientific evidence is clear. The procedure did not fix the underlying illness. It simply destroyed the patient's personality. It severed the parts of the brain responsible for judgment, empathy, foresight, and self-awareness. Patients were left emotionally blunted, apathetic, and listless, a condition one doctor bleakly described as surgically induced childhood. Dr. Freeman was a relentless showman. For our quirky tidbit, he traveled the country in a van he nicknamed the Lobotomobile, going from asylum to demonstrate his technique. He was known for his theatrical flair, sometimes performing two-handed lobotomies, one pick in each eye socket at the same time, to impress audiences of doctors and nurses. He was not a monster in his own mind. He was a pioneer, a savior. This leaves us with a dark and difficult question. Historians and medical ethicists still grapple with the question: Was the lobotomy a well-intentioned, if tragically misguided, attempt to help the hopeless in an era with no other options? Or was it a monstrous act of social control, a way to make difficult people more manageable? Was it a failed cure? Or was it a successful method of silencing inconvenient souls? The lobotomy is a chilling reminder of our own recent past. It's a story of scientific hubris, of good intentions gone horribly wrong, and of the terrifying consequences of believing you can fix a person's soul with a hammer and a spike. It stands as a monument to the idea that sometimes the most insane acts in human history are not committed by the mad, but by the healers. The lobotomy was a crude and brutal instrument, an ice pick driven by a misguided desire to heal. It was a surgical attempt to impose quiet on a troubled mind. But as the 20th century marched on, the quest to control the human mind would leave the asylum and enter a far more shadowy realm, the world of espionage and covert operations. The tools would no longer be hammers and spikes, but something far more insidious: drugs, hypnosis, and psychological torture, all wielded by a government against its own citizens in a paranoid search for the ultimate weapon. Welcome to Project MK Ultra. You are in the America of the 1950s. The Cold War is at its absolute peak. There is a deep, pervasive fear of the Soviet Union, a fear of nuclear annihilation, and a new, more subtle terror: the idea of brainwashing. American prisoners of war returning from Korea were giving strange, stilted confessions, and the CIA became utterly convinced that the communists had developed a truth serum, or a sophisticated method of mind control. And in the twisted logic of the Cold War, if the enemy has a terrifying new weapon, you must develop an even better one yourself. This was the birth of MK Ultra. The project's goal, laid out in classified documents, was as simple as it was monstrous: to investigate and develop methods for controlling the human mind. Can you induce a person to do things against their will? Can you erase their memories? Can you create a new personality, or even program a human being to be an unwitting assassin, a real-life Manchurian candidate? To find the answers, the CIA decided that all ethical boundaries were null and void. The project was a sprawling, multi-decade catalogue of horrors, conducted in secret on unwitting American and Canadian citizens. Imagine you are a patient at a psychiatric institute seeking help for depression. Your doctor, secretly funded by the CIA, gives you a new experimental treatment. It's a massive dose of a new drug called LSD. You are plunged into a terrifying multi-day psychedelic trip, while men in suits observe and take notes on your psychological breakdown. Or perhaps you are a patron at a bar in New York or San Francisco. The prostitute you go home with is on the CIA payroll. She drugs your drink, and you are observed through a two-way mirror as your consciousness dissolves, your secrets laid bare. These were the methods. They used hypnosis, sensory deprivation tanks, and extreme forms of verbal and sexual abuse. One of the most disturbing sub-projects was known as psychic driving, developed by a psychiatrist named Donald Ewan Cameron. In this treatment, patients were put into drug-induced comas for weeks or even months at a time, and while they were unconscious, they were forced to listen to a looped audio message over and over again, sometimes for hundreds of thousands of repetitions, in an attempt to break down their personality and rebuild it. This wasn't the work of a few rogue agents. Our mainstream historical fact is that Project MKUltra was officially sanctioned and funded by the United States government from 1953 until it was officially halted in 1973. Its existence only came to light in 1975, thanks to the investigative work of a congressional body known as the Church Committee, which exposed decades of illegal intelligence activities. When the committee began to investigate, they ran into a major roadblock. This is our key scientific, or rather anti-scientific, evidence. In 1973, on the orders of then CIA Director Richard Helms, the vast majority of MK-Ultra records were deliberately destroyed. It was a systematic attempt to erase one of the darkest chapters in the agency's history. However, thousands of documents survived due to a clerical error, and along with the sworn testimony of victims and former researchers, they have allowed us to piece together a chilling, if incomplete, picture of the project's scope. One of the most unsettling potential connections to MK-Ultra serves as our quirky tidbit. Between 1959 and 1962, a brilliant but vulnerable young undergraduate at Harvard named Ted Kaczynski, who would later become the Unabomber, volunteered for a psychological study run by a professor named Henry Murray. This study involved subjecting participants to intense, personally abusive and humiliating interrogations to measure their stress reactions. It is now widely suspected that Murray's study was at least partially funded by the CIA as part of the MK-Ultra network. It's impossible to know for sure, but many have speculated that this brutal psychological experiment may have been a key factor in Kaczynski's subsequent mental breakdown and his violent crusade against technology. Because of the deliberate destruction of files, the full story will never be known. Because of the destroyed records, the full scope and success of MK-Ultra remains unknown. Historians of the Cold War still debate how many people were affected and whether any of the mind control techniques actually worked in any meaningful operational way. Did they ever successfully program an assassin? Did they ever extract a crucial secret? The likely answer is no. What is certain is that they shattered the lives of countless innocent people in the process. MK-Ultra represents a different kind of human insanity. This was not the result of misguided science or ancient superstition. This was the cold, calculated weaponization of science itself. It was the product of a paranoid worldview where the ends, national security, justified any conceivable means. It's the story of a government that became so afraid of the monsters on the other side of the world that it decided to create its own right at home. Project MK-Ultra was an insanity that festered in the shadows, a product of state-sponsored paranoia. But sometimes the most widespread and dangerous forms of madness don't happen in secret government labs. They happen in plain sight, on Main Street, sold in brightly packaged boxes with the full-throated approval of doctors, scientists, and enthusiastic celebrities. This is the insanity of the marketplace, a time when a new scientific discovery was so wondrous, so full of promise, that people willingly paid to drink poison as a health tonic. Welcome to the dawn of the atomic age and the deadly allure of radium. The story begins with a genuine miracle. You are in Paris at the turn of the 20th century. Marie and Pierre Curie have just made their groundbreaking discovery of a new element, radium. And it seems to be magical. It is a substance that glows in the dark with an ethereal blue-green light. It produces its own heat, its own energy, seemingly out of nothing. In an age before the mechanics of the atom were understood, this looked like the very essence of life force, a captured piece of the sun. The press and the public went wild. Radium wasn't just a scientific curiosity. It was a promise of boundless energy, of restored vitality, of a cure for all that ails you. And so, the craze began. Entrepreneurs, quacks, and even some legitimate companies rushed to cash in on this new miracle element. Soon, you could buy anything and everything infused with the life-giving power of radium. There were radium-laced chocolates, radium toothpastes, radium face creams that promised a youthful glow. You could buy radium-infused blankets, radium suppositories, and even radium-lined athletic supporters for men. The most famous of these products was Radithor, essentially radium dissolved in distilled water, sold as an energy drink for the wealthy. It was the 1920s equivalent of a 5-hour energy shot, but with a half-life of 1,600 years. The most iconic image of this era, however, comes from the factories. Our mainstream historical fact centers on the radium girls. These were young women, mostly in their teens and early 20s, who were hired for their nimble fingers to work in watch factories in New Jersey, Illinois, and Connecticut. Their job was to paint the numbers on watch dials with a new, glow-in-the-dark paint made from radium. To get a precise, fine point on their tiny brushes, their supervisors taught them a technique called lip pointing. They would dip the brush in the radium paint, and then, for a moment, place the bristles between their lips to shape the tip. Dip, lick, paint, hundreds of times a day. For fun, they would sometimes paint their nails or teeth with the glowing paint before a night out. They were told it was perfectly safe. The horror began to unfold a few years later. The girls started developing mysterious and terrifying illnesses. Their teeth fell out. Their jaws began to ache and then swell, developing huge, grotesque tumors in a condition that became known as radium jaw. Their bones, especially their spines and legs, would spontaneously fracture. They were dying, slowly and in agony. The radium they had ingested was a Trojan horse. The body, mistaking it for calcium, had deposited it directly into their bones, where it would sit for the rest of their lives, silently, relentlessly bombarding their own cells with radiation. The tragic story of the radium girls was mirrored in the tale of Eben Byers, a wealthy industrialist and celebrity athlete who was a devoted customer of Radithor. After a minor injury, his doctor prescribed the radium water to help him heal. Byers loved the stuff, claiming it gave him a toned-up feeling, and began drinking 2 or 3 bottles of it every single day. He continued this for several years until the inevitable happened. His teeth began to fall out. His bones started to deteriorate. A reporter who visited him near the end of his life wrote that Byers's entire upper jaw, excepting 2 front teeth, and most of his lower jaw had been removed, and that holes were literally forming in his skull. The scientific evidence of radium's deadly power is now undeniable. Marie Curie herself died of aplastic anemia, her bone marrow destroyed by her long-term exposure. And the bodies of the radium girls are still so radioactive today that they will be for more than a millennium. When their remains have been exhumed for study, Geiger counters click wildly. This brings us to our grim and quirky tidbit. When Eben Byers died in 1932, he was so radioactive that he had to be buried in a thick, lead-lined coffin to prevent his corpse from poisoning the surrounding soil. His gruesome death, and a famous Wall Street Journal article titled "The Radium Water Worked Until His Jaw Came Off," was a major catalyst for the creation of the Food and Drug Administration, FDA. This entire tragic episode leaves us with a lingering, uncomfortable question. Historians of technology and health still debate how much the companies involved knew about the dangers. Was it pure, widespread ignorance driven by a faith in scientific miracles? Or did some companies willfully ignore early evidence of harm in the pursuit of enormous profits? The company that employed the radium girls, for instance, commissioned studies that confirmed the toxicity but chose to hide the results. The radium era is a terrifying story of a collective delusion, where the promise of a scientific miracle was so powerful it turned a deadly poison into a health craze. It is a testament to the fact that our desire to believe in a simple, magical cure can sometimes be the most dangerous disease of all. The tragic story of the Radium Girls and the miracle cure that was actually a poison shows a profound, almost pathological desire to preserve and enhance the living body. It is a story born from a deep-seated fear of decay, a fear that has driven so much of human history, from the Egyptian embalmer to the modern cosmetic surgeon. But our journey now takes us to a place where this entire worldview is turned on its head. We travel to the roof of the world, to the high plateaus of Tibet, to witness a funeral rite so completely alien to Western sensibilities that it forces us to question our most basic assumptions about death, the body, and what it means to be human. You are standing on a vast, wind-swept plain, surrounded by jagged, snow-capped mountains that scrape the sky. The air is thin and achingly cold. The ground is hard, rocky, and frozen for much of the year. In this stark and beautiful landscape, a small procession is making its way up a hillside to a designated open-air space known as a charnel ground. They are carrying a body, wrapped in a simple white cloth, but they have not come here to bury it. The body is laid upon a flat rock. A figure known as a Rogyapa, or body breaker, approaches. This is his sacred and professional duty. He unwraps the body and, with a series of precise, practiced cuts, begins to dismember it. This is not a violent or frenzied act. It is methodical, calm, and efficient. As he works, another group of attendees has gathered nearby. They are not human. They are vultures, hundreds of them, who have learned to recognize the signs of the ritual and now wait with a strange, patient stillness. When the Rogyapa is finished, he steps back, and the birds descend. In a flurry of powerful wings, they cover the remains, and in a remarkably short amount of time, they consume all the flesh. But the ritual is not over. The Rogyapa then gathers the bones that are left behind. He places them on a flat stone and, using a large mallet, painstakingly pulverizes them into a fine dust. This bone dust is then mixed with sampa, roasted barley flour, and is offered up one last time for the smaller birds, like crows and hawks, who could not compete with the vultures. Within a few hours, almost no physical trace of the person is left on the earth. This is the Tibetan sky burial, or jator. To an outsider, the practice can seem shocking, even barbaric. But within the framework of Vajrayana Buddhism, it is one of the most profound and beautiful acts a person can perform. It is all about perspective. The philosophy is this: at the moment of death, the spirit, the consciousness, leaves the body. What remains is no longer a person. It is an empty vessel, a piece of flesh and bone with no more significance than an empty house. To lovingly embalm it, to seal it in a fancy box, and to preserve it in the ground is seen as a pointless, sentimental attachment to something that is already gone. Instead, the body is seen as one final opportunity to perform an act of supreme generosity, a concept known in Buddhism as dana. You are giving your final physical possession, your own flesh and blood, as a charitable gift to feed other living creatures. This brings us to our mainstream historical fact. The practice of jator, or sky burial, has been a traditional funeral rite in Tibet and surrounding Himalayan regions for centuries, and despite being a subject of intense curiosity and often misunderstood, it is still performed today. The vultures themselves are not seen as mere scavengers. They are revered, sometimes seen as sacred animals called dakinis, or sky dancers, who carry the departed soul up into the heavens. There is also a deeply practical ecological reason for this ritual. This is the scientific evidence, in an environmental sense. On the Tibetan plateau, the ground is often frozen permafrost, and the soil is thin and rocky. Burying a body is physically almost impossible. Furthermore, the region is high above the tree line, making wood for cremation an incredibly scarce and precious resource. Sky burial is a stunningly efficient and ecologically sound solution to the problem of corpse disposal in one of the world's harshest environments. This leads to a fascinating chicken and egg question, the subject of our open scholarly debate. Anthropologists and theologians debate the origins of the practice. Did the practical ecological necessity of disposing of bodies in a harsh landscape come first, with the profound Buddhist philosophy of generosity later developing to sanctify it? Or was the spiritual belief in feeding the birds the primary motivation from the start, which just happened to align perfectly with the environmental realities? It is a classic question of which came first, the belief or the practice. The tools and the process are steeped in tradition. A quirky tidbit is that the specific flaying knives and mallets used by the Rogyapa are often sacred objects themselves, passed down through generations, acquiring a unique spiritual weight through their repeated use in this ultimate act of compassionate detachment. Sky burial is perhaps the ultimate test of cultural perspective. It is an act that directly confronts our deepest taboos about the sanctity of the corpse. It takes what we see as a vessel of memory to be preserved and recasts it as a final, charitable meal. It proves, in the most visceral way imaginable, that one culture's act of horrifying desecration can be another's sublime expression of faith. Insanity, it seems, is often just a matter of where you stand. The Tibetan sky burial is a practice born from a deep and reverent connection to the sky. It is a philosophy that sees the heavens as a sacred space, a final destination for the soul. It is a gesture of profound respect. But now, we plummet from this spiritual peak into the paranoid, frantic depths of the 20th century, to a time when the sky was not a sacred space, but a strategic one. A time when the most powerful nation on Earth, in a fit of geopolitical panic, looked up at the serene, beautiful face of the moon and seriously considered punching it with a nuclear bomb. You are in America in the year 1958. The Cold War is a suffocating blanket of fear and suspicion. Just a year earlier, the Soviet Union had achieved a stunning technological and propaganda victory by launching Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite. The constant, faint beep, beep, beep of the Soviet satellite passing overhead was a deeply unnerving sound for Americans, a celestial reminder that they were falling behind in the race for technological supremacy. The press called it a technological Pearl Harbor. The panic was real. The US government was desperate for a way to demonstrate its power, to reassure its allies, and to terrify its enemies. They needed a grand gesture. And so, in the secret corridors of the US Air Force and the Armor Research Foundation in Chicago, a plan was born. Its official title was the bland and bureaucratic A Study of Lunar Research Flights, but its secret internal name was Project A119. The plan was as simple as it was breathtakingly insane: to launch a rocket at the moon, carrying a W-25 nuclear warhead, and detonate it on the lunar surface. The primary goal of this project was not scientific. In fact, scientists on the project were horrified by the idea. The goal was pure, uncut, 100-proof public relations. The explosion was to be timed and placed so that it would be visible to the naked eye from Earth. The planners envisioned a brilliant flash of light, followed by a massive mushroom cloud of dust and debris rising from the lunar surface, silhouetted against the blackness of space. It would be a cosmic flex, an unmistakable message to the Soviets and the world. Do not mess with us. We can put an atomic bomb on the moon. This was not a fantasy. This is our mainstream historical fact. Project A119 was a very real, top-secret plan developed throughout 1958. And in one of the most fascinating footnotes of scientific history, one of the junior members hired to work on the project was a brilliant young astronomer tasked with modeling the behavior of the lunar dust cloud after the explosion to ensure it would be visible. His name was Carl Sagan. Decades later, long after the project was declassified, Sagan would reveal his involvement, noting the deep moral reservations he had even then. The scientific evidence gathered by Sagan and the other physicists on the team confirmed that the plan was technically feasible. A 1.7 kiloton bomb, similar in yield to the one dropped on Hiroshima, would indeed create a flash bright enough to be seen from Earth. But they also pointed out the catastrophic risks. What if the rocket launch failed? A multi-stage rocket carrying a live nuclear warhead could fall back to Earth, potentially detonating over a friendly country, or worse, on American soil. And even if the mission succeeded, it would cause irreparable harm. The pristine 4.5 billion-year-old lunar environment would be permanently contaminated with radioactive elements, destroying any future chance of studying the moon's true origins or searching for clues about the early solar system. The planners were meticulous, which gives us our quirky tidbit. To ensure the best possible show, they calculated the optimal place and time for the detonation. The bomb was to be aimed at the terminator, the dividing line between the sunlit and dark portions of the moon's surface. Detonating it on the dark side, just over the edge of the crescent, during a full moon on Earth, would provide the perfect black backdrop to maximize the visibility of the atomic flash for everyone back home. It was stagecraft on a celestial scale. The project was ultimately cancelled in 1959, likely because the Air Force realized the risks were too great, and that a failed mission would be a PR disaster of epic proportions. But the fact that it was ever seriously considered remains a subject of study. Historians of the Cold War and the space race still debate the project's true significance. Was it a genuinely considered military option? A last-ditch act of geopolitical desperation? Or was it more of a thought experiment, a product of a military-industrial complex flush with cash and ordered to explore every conceivable option, no matter how outlandish? Project A119 represents a unique kind of human madness. It is the ultimate expression of tribal chest-thumping, a plan to vandalize our own solar system for a momentary display of power. It's the story of a time when our technological capabilities had just begun to reach for the stars. And one of the very first things we thought to do was to throw a rock at our closest, most serene celestial neighbor. It's a profound and humbling reminder that even as we reach for the heavens, we often carry our most primitive and destructive impulses with us. Project A119 was a monument to modern insanity, a plan born from the cold, rational, and yet utterly paranoid logic of the Cold War. It represented a desire to impose human will on the cosmos itself. Let us now retreat from that terrifying precipice of the future and journey back thousands of years to a civilization that also sought to impose order on a chaotic world, not with rockets, but with scrolls and scalpels. We are returning to the banks of the Nile, to ancient Egypt, to explore a medical system that was an unbelievable, almost schizophrenic mixture of sheer genius and what can only be described as weaponized disgust. You are in a house of life near a grand temple in Thebes around 1500 BC. This is the closest thing the ancient world has to a combination of a university, a library, and a doctor's office. A physician, a priest of the goddess Sekhmet, is examining a patient. His approach is remarkably modern. He doesn't just listen to the patient's complaints, he observes. He takes their pulse, understanding that the heartbeat is the center of a network of channels, or mitu, that run through the body. He smells their breath and inspects their wounds with a methodical calm. This is the genius of Egyptian medicine. We know from ancient texts like the Edwin Smith Papyrus, a document focused on trauma surgery, that these physicians were brilliant observers. They could diagnose and classify dozens of different types of skull fractures with a precision that is still impressive today. They set broken bones with splints, stitched wounds shut, and performed minor surgeries with bronze instruments. They had a sophisticated understanding of anatomy, gleaned from their extensive work in mummification. They were, in many ways, the world's first true clinicians. And then, there was the other side of their practice, the side that makes you wonder if you've walked into a completely different building. Because for the Egyptians, magic and medicine were not separate disciplines. They were two sides of the same coin. A physical remedy was often considered useless unless it was accompanied by the correct magical spell or incantation, chanted at the right time, to drive out the malevolent spirit or angry god causing the illness. This brings us to the remedies themselves, which are recorded in great detail. Our mainstream historical fact comes from the Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest and most important medical texts in history. It is a 65-foot-long scroll containing over 700 remedies and formulas. And while some are rational, many are not. Imagine you are a woman seeking a form of birth control. The physician prepares a pessary for you, a device to be inserted into the body. The active ingredient? Crocodile dung, mixed with fermented dough and honey. The logic is a complete mystery to us. Perhaps they believed the pungent, earthy smell would be a deterrent. Perhaps the crocodile, a creature of the god Sobek, was thought to have magical, protective properties. Whatever the reason, this was a mainstream, prescribed contraceptive. Or perhaps you have an issue with your eyesight. A common remedy for blindness involved mixing the ground-up eyes of a pig with antimony, red ochre, and honey. This lovely concoction was then not put in your eyes, but poured directly into your ear. If you had a splinter, the recommended treatment was a poultice made from worm's blood and donkey dung, which was to be applied directly to the wound. It's easy to dismiss all of this as pure, unhygienic madness. And yet, when we apply modern science, we find glimmers of accidental brilliance hidden within the filth. This is our scientific evidence. While donkey dung is a breeding ground for deadly tetanus bacteria, the moldy bread that was often applied to wounds could have contained naturally occurring antibiotic fungi, a primitive form of penicillin. The honey used in almost every concoction is a powerful natural antibacterial and antiseptic agent. While they were prescribing crocodile dung, they were also prescribing castor oil as a laxative and tannin from acacia nuts to treat burns, both of which are still used in medicine today. They were astute observers of what worked, even if their explanations for why it worked were wildly off the mark. The specialization of their doctors also speaks to their sophisticated system. This gives us our quirky tidbit. The Egyptians had physicians who specialized in different parts of the body. The historian Herodotus tells us of eye doctors and tooth doctors. We even have records of a specialist known by the official title Shepherd of the Anus, a royal proctologist for the pharaohs. This strange duality has been a source of endless fascination. Egyptologists and medical historians debate the exact relationship between the rational and magical elements in Egyptian medicine. Were the spells and incantations a separate spiritual layer of treatment, a kind of ancient placebo effect? Or did they believe the magic was chemically essential for activating the physical properties of the medicine itself? Was the spell what turned on the healing power of the honey? Egyptian medicine is a perfect snapshot of a civilization in transition. It embodies the messy, often contradictory struggle between a world governed by gods and spirits and a new world governed by observation and diagnosis. It shows us that the path to scientific truth is never a straight line. It is a meandering trial-and-error journey, one that occasionally requires a healthy dose of crocodile dung to move forward. We have seen how the ancient Egyptians walked a tightrope between magic and medicine, between a prayer to the gods and a poultice of donkey dung. They were trying to influence the body with the tools of the spirit, and the spirit with the tools of the body. It was a messy, intertwined worldview. Now we leap forward to our own time, to a quiet, sterile laboratory, where that ancient ambition has been distilled to its terrifying logical conclusion. The attempt to prove that the spirit is not just influenced by the body, but that it is a direct product of the brain, an experience that can be turned on and off with the flick of a switch. Imagine you are a volunteer for a neuroscience experiment. You are not in a dusty tomb or a chaotic operating theater. You are in a quiet university lab, filled with the gentle hum of computers. The researcher, a calm and reassuring man, leads you to a special room. It is an acoustic chamber, soundproof and completely dark. In the center is a comfortable chair. He asks you to sit and relax, and then he brings out the device, a modified snowmobile helmet with a tangle of wires leading from it. On the sides, near where your temples will be, are a series of solenoids. He places the helmet on your head. This is the Koran helmet, better known to the world as the God helmet. The researcher leaves, and you are plunged into perfect silence and darkness. The helmet is switched on. You don't feel much, perhaps a faint warmth or a low hum. You are instructed to simply sit and report any sensations you might have. You close your eyes. The minutes tick by. At first, there is nothing but the sound of your own breathing. But then, you feel it. It is a subtle but unmistakable shift in the room's atmosphere. You get the distinct and deeply unnerving sensation that you are not alone. There is a presence in the room with you. It doesn't speak. It doesn't move. It is just there. For some, this presence feels benevolent, like an ain't or a spirit guide. For others, it feels ominous, even terrifying. This was the experiment, repeated hundreds of times from the 1980s onward, by its inventor, the cognitive neuroscientist Michael Persinger. His theory was as radical as it was elegant. He proposed that many, if not all, spiritual, mystical, and paranormal experiences, the feeling of a ghostly presence, out-of-body sensations, visions of God, even alien abductions, are not external events. He believed they were the product of complex electrical activity, or micro-seizures, in the temporal lobes of the brain, the regions just above your ears. The helmet was designed to artificially induce this specific, complex pattern of brain activity by generating weak, targeted magnetic fields. The results, at first, seemed to be a stunning confirmation of his theory. Our mainstream historical fact is that for years, Persinger and his team at Laurentian University in Canada published numerous peer-reviewed studies claiming that a huge percentage of their volunteers, as high as 80%, reported experiencing a sensed presence or other strange phenomena while the helmet was active. It seemed he had found the God spot in the brain. However, the story of the God helmet is also a story about the difficulty of doing science on the edges of human experience. This is where the controversy and the scientific evidence against the theory come in. When other labs tried to replicate Persinger's astonishing results, they largely failed. The most significant blow came from a study in Sweden, where researchers used a much stricter double-blind protocol. In their experiment, neither the volunteer nor the researcher in the room with them knew whether the helmet was actually on or off. Under these conditions, the effect vanished. People were just as likely to feel a presence when the helmet was off as when it was on. The Swedish team concluded that the original results were likely due to a powerful combination of sensory deprivation, the power of suggestion, and the inherent personality traits of the volunteers. It was, in effect, a high-tech placebo. The device got its famous nickname, our quirky tidbit, after a well-publicized encounter with the prominent atheist and scientist Richard Dawkins. He wore the helmet for a BBC documentary, hoping, as he said, to experience the divine. But after the session, he reported feeling nothing more than a bit relaxed, slightly dizzy, and a strange sensation in his legs. The God helmet had failed to make its most famous skeptic a believer. And yet, the idea it represents is too powerful to dismiss, sparking a profound debate in a field known as neurotheology. The entire field grapples with the central question raised by Persinger's work, regardless of its flaws. If we can artificially induce a spiritual experience by stimulating the brain, what does that say about the nature of spirituality itself? Is God just a pattern of neural firings in our temporal lobes? Is every prophet who heard the voice of God, every mystic who felt a divine presence, simply a person with unusually sensitive temporal lobes? The God helmet is the modern scientific culmination of a journey we started with trepanation, the ancient desperate need to get inside the head to touch the spirit. It leaves us with the most unsettling question of all. Is our entire vast and colorful history of religion, myth, and divine encounters just a ghost in the machine of our own brain, a phantom that we can now, perhaps, summon at will? The God helmet represents a modern, clinical attempt to isolate the most profound human experiences, the sense of the divine, the feeling of a presence, and reduce them to a pattern of neural firings. It is an exploration of the lonely internal landscape of the individual mind. But the human mind is rarely, if ever, a truly isolated system. We are social creatures, wired for connection, and this wiring has a strange and powerful side effect. Sometimes our minds connect so strongly that our internal states, our fears, our anxieties, and even our laughter can become contagious, spreading through a population like a virus and creating a feedback loop of collective madness. We leave the quiet solitude of the neuroscience lab and travel to the village of Kashasha in what was then Tanganyika, now Tanzania, in the year 1962. You are in a classroom at a mission-run boarding school for girls. It is a normal day. The air is warm and humid. The lesson is droning on. Then one of the students tells a joke, and a few of her friends start to giggle. It's a familiar, innocent sound. But then, something strange happens. The giggling doesn't stop. The laughter grows in intensity, becoming hysterical, uncontrollable. The girls who started it are now laughing so hard they are crying, unable to catch their breath. And then, the strangest part. The laughter begins to spread. Another girl in the class starts laughing, then another. It moves through the room, not like a shared moment of joy, but like a contagion. Within a few hours, nearly 100 of the school's 159 students are consumed by these fits of uncontrollable laughter. This was not happy laughter. It was painful, incapacitating. The afflicted girls were exhausted, their muscles aching. They suffered from crying spells, fainting, rashes, and respiratory distress. The school authorities were completely baffled, and unable to restore order, were forced to shut the school down and send the students home to their respective villages. But this didn't end the epidemic. It just spread it. When the girls arrived home, the laughter plague spread to their families and neighbors. Another school in a nearby village had to be closed. Then another. And another. This incredible event is our mainstream historical fact. The Tanganyika laughter epidemic of 1962 is one of the most famous and well-documented cases of mass psychogenic illness, MPI, in modern history. The epidemic rolled through the region for months, with some reports indicating it lasted for over a year. By the time it finally burned itself out, it had affected more than 1,000 people and forced the closure of 14 different schools. Medical teams rushed to the area, desperately searching for a cause. This is the crucial scientific evidence. They found nothing. They tested the food, the water, the local environment. They ran blood tests on the victims. There was no virus, no bacteria, no environmental toxin that could explain the symptoms. The only possible diagnosis was mass hysteria, a psychological condition triggered by stress and then spread through subconscious social contagion. So what was the underlying stress? Tanganyika had just achieved its independence from British rule in December of 1961. The entire country was in a state of massive social and political transition. These schoolgirls, part of the first generation to be educated in this new nation, were under immense pressure. They carried the high expectations of their families and their country on their young shoulders, all while living in the strict, disciplined, and unfamiliar environment of a mission boarding school. The laughter, it seems, was the crack in the psychological dam holding back an immense flood of collective anxiety. A fascinating and quirky tidbit about the epidemic is how selective it was. The laughter primarily affected the young students. It almost never spread to the teachers or to other, older, more educated adults, even when they were in close contact with the victims. This strongly suggests that the hysteria was linked to the specific social status and psychological pressures being felt by that particular demographic. The Tanganyika laughter epidemic is a powerful modern bookend to the dancing plague of 1518. It shows that these bizarre outbreaks are not relics of a superstitious, pre-scientific age. They are a timeless feature of the human condition, and the central mystery remains. Sociologists and psychologists who study MP1 still debate the precise mechanisms of its transmission. Is it a subconscious form of protest against an oppressive environment? A culturally sanctioned way to express unbearable stress? Or a more primal neurological mirroring effect that bypasses conscious thought entirely? This event is a humbling reminder that our sense of individual autonomy is, in many ways an illusion. We are nodes in a vast, interconnected network, and the emotional state of that network can sometimes overwhelm our own. It proves that even something as joyful and innocent as laughter can, under the right psychological pressure, become a plague, a bizarre and uncontrollable form of shared human insanity. The laughter epidemic of 1962 is a startling reminder that our individual minds are deeply susceptible to the psychological states of those around us. It shows how an emotion can leap from person to person, creating a collective physiological event. But what if this kind of porous, interconnected consciousness wasn't an anomaly? What if, for most of human history, it was the normal state of affairs? We are now entering the realm of grand speculative theory to explore an idea so radical it proposes that the very thing you are using to understand these words, your private, internal, self-aware mind, is a relatively new invention, born from the collapse of an older, stranger, and profoundly insane mental operating system. Let your mind travel back 3,000 years. You are in the world of Homer's Iliad, a chaotic, violent landscape of warring heroes and meddling gods. Or perhaps you are in ancient Mesopotamia, hearing the first epic poems recited. According to the psychologist Julian Jaynes, the people living in this world were not like you. They looked like you, they fought and loved like you, but their internal experience was completely different. They were not conscious in the way we understand the term. They did not have that constant internal narrator you call me. They did not weigh options, ponder their own motives, or introspect. So, how did they function? This is the core of Jaynes's radical theory of the bicameral mind, published in 1976. He argued that until around the first millennium BC, the human mind was split into two chambers, or cameral. One part, the executive part, carried out daily tasks based on habit and routine. But when a new or stressful situation arose that required a decision, a different part of the brain would generate a command. This command was not experienced as a thought, but as an auditory hallucination. It was a voice, heard as clearly as someone speaking next to you. And this voice was interpreted as the direct, undeniable command of a god, a dead king, or a revered ancestor. Imagine being a warrior on the battlefield. You are frozen with indecision. Suddenly, you hear the voice of Athena in your ear, commanding you to pick up that spear and charge. You do not think, "That's a good idea." You simply obey. For the bicameral man, there was no gap between thought and action, because thought itself was an external command from an all-powerful authority. The voice of God was not a metaphor. It was a neurological reality, a routine brain function. The mainstream historical fact, or rather the core evidence Jaynes presented, was his deep and controversial analysis of ancient literature. He famously argued that in the earliest texts, like the Iliad or the older books of the Bible, there is no evidence of introspection. The characters are not self-aware. They don't have internal monologues. When Achilles is about to draw his sword in a rage, the goddess Athena physically appears to him, and only to him, grabs him by the hair, and tells him to stop. He doesn't decide. He is instructed. This, Jaynes claimed, was not poetic license, but a literal description of the bicameral experience. According to his theory, this mental model began to break down sometime between the 3rd and 1st millennia BC. The rise of large, complex societies, mass migrations that jumbled different cultures and their gods, and crucially, the invention of writing, all began to weaken the authority of these hallucinatory voices. For the first time, the gods fell silent. This breakdown was not a gentle transition. It was a terrifying existential crisis. The old source of guidance was gone, and humanity was cast adrift in a sea of terrifying silence. To survive, the brain had to create a new way of navigating the world. A simulated, internal space where different options could be weighed and decisions could be made. This new space was consciousness. Your internal monologue is the ghost of the voice of God. Of course, this is a theory of psychology, not archaeology, so there is no direct scientific evidence. It is an interpretation, not a fossil. But Janes supported his idea by pointing to modern phenomena that he saw as vestiges of our older mentality. The commanding auditory hallucinations experienced by schizophrenics, the powerful influence of a hypnotist's voice, the way young children often have imaginary friends who give them advice. All of these, he argued, were echoes of our bicameral past. A fascinating and quirky tidbit from his theory is his explanation for the rise of oracles and divination after the breakdown. Janes argued that once the internal voices of the gods fell silent, people became desperate to hear them again. This led to a frantic search for external sources of divine command. People began casting lots, reading entrails, and making long, arduous pilgrimages to places like the Oracle at Delphi, all in an attempt to replicate the certainty of the guidance they had lost. Janes's idea remains one of the most magnificent and divisive theories ever proposed about the human mind. Julian Janes's theory is one of the most magnificent and controversial ideas in the history of psychology. While it is almost universally rejected by mainstream neuroscience and anthropology as unfalsifiable speculation, it continues to fascinate philosophers and literary critics. The debate centers on whether it should be seen as a literal hypothesis about the brain or as a powerful metaphor for a profound shift in human culture and self-perception. The theory of the bicameral mind is perhaps the ultimate hypothesis of human insanity. It suggests that the entire architecture of modern thought, the very I that you assume to be the core of your being, is a relatively recent adaptation, a piece of software written in a panic after our original God-haunted operating system crashed. It leaves us with the unsettling possibility that our ancestors were all merely puppets, their strings pulled by the divine voices echoing inside their own skulls. The theory of the bicameral mind offers a breathtaking, if unprovable, vision of our past. A world where our own thoughts were alien voices, the commands of gods. It suggests our modern consciousness was a desperate adaptation to a profound internal silence. But what if the opposite is true? What if the great leap forward in the human mind wasn't a response to a loss of voices, but was instead sparked by the discovery of a substance that created new ones? We now turn to one of the most audacious, celebrated, and scientifically reviled theories of human origins ever proposed: the stoned ape hypothesis. Your journey takes you to the African savannah 2 million years ago. The world is vast, dangerous, and full of promise. You are with a small band of our ancestors, likely Homo erectus. You are not at the top of the food chain. Your brain is only about half the size of a modern human's. You are a clever ape, learning to make crude stone tools, struggling to survive. But something is about to happen. An event so significant that it will light a fire in your mind and change the evolutionary trajectory of the planet forever. And it will all start with a humble fungus. This is the theory proposed by the charismatic ethnobotanist and mystic Terence McKenna. He looked at the puzzle of human evolution, specifically the sudden and dramatic doubling of the human brain's size in a relatively short period, and he found the conventional explanations lacking. What, he asked, was the catalyst? His answer was as elegant as it was outlandish. The catalyst was psychedelic mushrooms. Here's how his theory works. As our ancestors moved from the forests out into the open grasslands, they began to follow herds of large, wild cattle and other herbivores. And growing in the nutrient-rich dung of these animals was a specific mushroom, psilocybe cubensis, a potent source of the psychedelic compound psilocybin. As curious omnivorous foragers, our ancestors would have inevitably tried eating them. And according to McKenna, this act changed everything. He proposed a three-stage effect. At very low doses, he argued, psilocybin acts as a mild stimulant and enhances visual acuity. Your eyesight literally gets better. Your ability to spot a predator in the distance or to see the subtle movements of prey is sharpened. This would have made the mushroom-eating hominins more successful hunters and survivors, giving them an immediate evolutionary advantage. At slightly higher, recreational doses, McKenna claimed the mushrooms would have acted as a powerful aphrodisiac and central nervous system stimulant, breaking down monogamous, alpha male-dominated social structures. This would have led to more group sexual activity, more genetic mixing, and a greater sense of community and tribal bonding. And then, at high, ceremonial doses, the mushrooms would have plunged our ancestors into the full-blown psychedelic experience. They would have experienced profound states of ego dissolution, seen vibrant geometric patterns behind their closed eyes, and felt a connection to a vast mystical dimension. This, McKenna argued, was the birth of religion, of symbolic thought, and of language itself, as our ancestors struggled to find the words to describe the beautiful, terrifying, and ineffable visions they were sharing. The backdrop for this theory is a genuine scientific mystery. Our mainstream historical fact is that the human brain underwent an unprecedented and explosive growth spurt, a process called encephalization, starting around 2 million years ago. Why this great leap forward happened is one of the biggest unanswered questions in paleoanthropology. McKenna's theory, while extreme, is an attempt to provide an answer to that question. But is there any proof? This is where the theory leaves the realm of science and enters the realm of pure speculation. The scientific evidence for the stoned ape hypothesis is, to put it mildly, non-existent. There is no archaeological proof that early hominins ate mushrooms, as fungi are organic and do not fossilize. McKenna's claims about psilocybin enhancing vision or acting as an aphrodisiac are not strongly supported by modern clinical research. For these reasons, the theory is almost universally dismissed by the mainstream scientific community as a compelling story with no data to back it up. The theory's popularity comes from its champion and its audience. A quirky tidbit is that Terence McKenna was a central figure in the psychedelic and counterculture movements. His theory gained its fame not through peer-reviewed papers, but through his mesmerizing lectures, his appearances at raves, and his enthusiastic adoption by the early internet community. It is a piece of modern folklore, a myth about our own origins that is deeply appealing to those who feel that there must be more to the story of consciousness than just hunting and gathering. And yet, the idea stubbornly persists in the corners of academic discussion. While mainstream science dismisses the hypothesis outright, it occasionally resurfaces in philosophical and anthropological discussions. The debate is less about its factual accuracy and more about what it represents, a challenge to the conventional, purely utilitarian models of evolution. Could non-ordinary states of consciousness, whether from psychedelics, fasting, or ecstatic ritual, have played a more significant role in our cognitive evolution than we currently admit. The stoned ape hypothesis is the ultimate wild card in the story of human insanity. It proposes that our most cherished attribute, our self-aware, symbol-making, universe-pondering consciousness, was not a planned adaptation, but a psychedelic accident. It leaves us with the bizarre and humbling possibility that we owe our entire civilization to a strange fungus that our ancestors happened to find in a pile of dung. The stoned ape hypothesis, whether you view it as a brilliant insight or a psychedelic fantasy, leaves us staring into the deep abyss of our own origins, questioning the very nature of the consciousness we use to navigate the world. For 30 sections we have journeyed through that world, a sprawling museum of human strangeness. We have stood beside the ancient cyborg, witnessed the birth of ritual, and watched entire civilizations fall prey to bizarre beliefs and collective delusions. We have seen our species at its most brutal, its most creative, and its most profoundly, beautifully insane. And now, at the end of our journey, we must turn that same curious, unflinching gaze away from the past and hold up a mirror to ourselves. The final question is the most uncomfortable one of all. Are we any different? Look around you. Look at the world of the 21st century. We have sequenced the genome. We have landed robots on Mars. We have created a global network of instantaneous communication. We are, by any measure, the most technologically advanced and knowledgeable civilization in history. And yet, what would a future archaeologist make of us? They would find a species that spent hours a day staring into small, glowing rectangles, meticulously curating idealized digital ghosts of themselves for the approval of strangers. They would see a culture where influencers perform bizarre rituals and scripted dramas in their own homes for millions of followers, creating a new kind of virtual, parasocial tribe. They would find evidence of billions of people willingly addicting themselves to a constant stream of information designed to make them angry, anxious, and afraid. A phenomenon we casually call doom scrolling. They would see a civilization that was warned, with overwhelming scientific consensus, that their own actions were catastrophically changing the climate of their planet. And yet, they struggled to react, many choosing to deny the evidence entirely. They would unearth mountains of single-use plastics, remnants of a cargo cult of consumerism where people would line up for days, not for food, but for the latest iteration of a handheld communication device. We look back at the past, and we see its madness so clearly. We don't have knife hands like Too's 380, but we are on the verge of brain-computer interfaces and gene-editing technologies that will make his modification look like child's play. The cyborg dream is no longer a desperate act of survival. It is a corporate business plan. We no longer perform trepanation to release evil spirits, but we medicate ourselves with powerful psychotropic drugs on an unprecedented scale, chemically altering our brain states to cope with the pressures of modern life. We don't trust a phrenologist to read the bumps on our heads, but we place a blind, almost religious faith in opaque algorithms to tell us who we should love, what we should believe, and how we should feel. This sense of disorientation has a name. Our sociological fact for today comes from the sociologist Emil Durkheim, who coined the term anomy, a state of normlessness, where the rapid changes in society lead to a breakdown of shared values and a sense of disconnection and despair. It is a diagnosis that feels eerily familiar. The scientific evidence is all around us. in the countless studies linking our digital lives to rising rates of anxiety, depression, and loneliness. A deeply strange, quirky tidbit from our modern age is the documented existence of state-sponsored troll farms, entities that have proven it's possible for a small number of people to systematically manipulate the global conversation, to sow discord and paranoia on a massive scale, simply by exploiting the architecture of our new digital public square. Our collective mind, it turns out, is dangerously easy to hack. And so we are left with the great, unanswered question of our time. Sociologists and philosophers are in a fierce debate about the long-term effects of the digital age. Is this a temporary, chaotic adjustment period to a new technology, similar to the invention of the printing press? Or are we fundamentally rewiring the human brain and society in ways that are dangerously unstable and unsustainable? What this journey has shown us, from the first butchered bone to the glow of the smartphone screen, is that human insanity is not a bug in the system. It is a feature. It is the engine of our evolution, the source of our art, our religion, our science. It is the restless, irrational, pattern-seeking primate brain trying to make sense of an overwhelmingly complex universe. The line between a sacred ritual and a collective delusion, between a scientific breakthrough and a dangerous obsession, has always been razor thin, and it runs directly through the heart of this very moment. Now, as our long journey through the strangeness of our own history comes to a close, let the world outside begin to fade away. The stories of the past, with all their sound and fury, can soften now, their sharp edges blurring into the quiet of the night. These tales of bizarre rituals, of collective madness, of our ancestors' desperate and beautiful attempts to find meaning, are not meant to trouble your sleep, but to deepen it with a sense of profound and shared humanity. Every strange belief, every misguided cure, every monumental folly was simply our species trying to find its way in the dark, just as we are today. The story of human insanity is simply the story of being us, in all our flawed and wonderful complexity. So let the final images dissolve, let the questions drift away unanswered, and allow yourself to rest in the quiet, timeless mystery of it all.